Alvin Roland Bobuef was a kid who got caught in the undertow. On November 25, 1963, around 1 in the morning, he went to Dave Ferry's apartment on Louisiana Avenue Parkway, looking for a book. Minutes later, New Orleans police stormed the place. Ferry, Bobuef, and another kid named Martins were hauled off. Ferry went in on suspicion, the boys on vagrancy. Bobuef worried that being linked to Ferry meant he'd be expelled from school. He kept repeating the same line. He was just there for a book. Asked where he'd been for the past few days or whether he knew Oswald, Bobuef clammed up and demanded his lawyer, G. Ray Gill. That evening, the cops cut him loose. Jack S. Martin wasn't so lucky. Martin was a private investigator with a reputation for booze, paranoia, and running his mouth. On November 25th, he told the FBI he'd been listening to WWL-TV when he heard Ferry's name linked to Lee Harvey Oswald. He flipped. He unloaded everything he had ever thought about Ferry, no matter how outlandish. He said Ferry had been a civil air patrol commander, that Oswald had been one of his cadets, and that Ferry could have hypnotized the kid, maybe even planted a suggestion to kill the president. Martin swore he had seen photos in Ferry's house of cadets, including Oswald, and remembered Ferry drilling them with rifles and military-style fatigues. He described Ferry as a gay person, a hypnotist, and a man fascinated with firearms. Martin insisted Ferry might have been the one to teach Oswald how to shoot, maybe even how to buy a foreign weapon, like the one seen on television. Martin dragged up Ferry's arrest for crime against nature in Jefferson Parish. He speculated Oswald could have been one of the witnesses against him, later joining the Marines. If true, it tied Ferry's legal troubles to the same man accused of killing Kennedy. Martin passed these suspicions to Major Trosclair of the New Orleans Police, but felt ignored. So he went higher, to Assistant District Attorney Herman Coleman, a former journalist who knew Ferry's case well. Martin also contacted Hardy Davis, a bail bondsman, who told him Ferry was connected to attorney G. Ray Gill. According to Davis, Gill had even denied Ferry worked for him, even though Ferry lived down the street and was on his payroll. Martin painted Ferry as a brilliant but dangerous man, educated in Latin, Greek, math, and science, but expelled from seminary, disgraced from the church, and deeply corrupt. He called him a notorious sex deviant, and believed Ferry capable of any crime, including manipulating Oswald into killing Kennedy. Another voice joined the chorus. Edward Vobel, a flower shop worker who had known Ferry through the Civil Air Patrol, remembered Ferry as an oddball, emotional, eccentric, a man who rode a motorcycle and once cried listening to music. Vobel recalled CAP meetings at Moisant Airport, drills, bivouacs, even rifle practice. He said Ferry arranged a one-night training session on a farm in Kenner, where cadets were told to bring their own guns. Oswald had already quit by then, Vobel said, but the image was planted. Ferry teaching teenage boys military skills, guns, and discipline. Joseph Terlicker, a CAP commander in Metairie, tried to tamp things down. He admitted Ferry had commanded squadrons, but said records only went back 4 years, making it tough to confirm Oswald's membership. But Detective Frederick O'Sullivan remembered Oswald from Beauregard Junior High. Oswald was a loner, strange, unfriendly. The only kid he saw Oswald bond with was Vobel. O'Sullivan confirmed Oswald had been in Civil Air Patrol, and that Ferry had led units at Moisant. He added another detail. Ferry had a reputation for hypnotizing people, even demonstrating it on a cadet in front of others. The Bureau also tracked down David Magyar, a pilot who had flown dredging company executives to Mexico in September. Magyar knew Ferry from Eastern Airlines and Civil Air Patrol. He didn't consider him a close friend, but remembered Ferry's way with teenage boys. Magyar couldn't swear Oswald had been among them, but said Ferry's circle included men like George Piazza, a former CAP member, who might know more. Piece by piece, the net around Ferry was tightening. To the FBI, it wasn't just about where Ferry had been the weekend of the assassination. It was about his past, his boys, his habits, and his possible link to Oswald. And in every account, whether from frightened kids or bitter investigators, one truth kept surfacing. Wherever Oswald had been in his youth, Ferry's shadow wasn't far behind. By the summer of 1967, Jim Garrison's investigation was no longer a local story. It had become a national war of words, fought in courtrooms, on television, and in the press. The issue was simple, but explosive. Was Lee Harvey Oswald the lone assassin? Or was there a wider conspiracy with deep ties to New Orleans? Dallas authorities stood firm. They insisted Oswald fired the shots that killed John F. Kennedy in Dealey Plaza. Police Chief Jesse Curry, who had driven in the motorcade, swore there was no chaos before the shooting. He said if guerrilla gunmen had been stationed behind the 3-foot stone wall in the plaza, his men or Secret Service agents would have spotted them. "We just didn't see anything that would indicate that at all," Curry told reporters. The Dallas District Attorney, Henry Wade, backed him. Wade said 3 empty shells were found by the 6th-floor window of the Texas School Book Depository. Oswald's prints were there too. Everyone else was on the street watching the president pass. Oswald was upstairs, Wade insisted. For Garrison, which wasn't enough. He argued Oswald had been a pawn in a larger plot, one that included New Orleans businessman Clay Shaw, ex-pilot David Ferry, Cuban exile Sergio Arcacha Smith, and mysterious figures tied to the CIA. Garrison pointed to tangible bullets. Strange ammunition, he said, was designed to explode into fragments, leaving no trace back to the weapon. He called it the work of intelligence forces. A firearms expert dismissed that claim, explaining that frangible bullets shattered on impact, but still left telltale elements. The FBI said bullet fragments found on the president's stretcher and another from Oswald's rifle matched. Curry told the press Garrison's probe hadn't proven anything beyond the Warren Commission's original findings. Meanwhile, Garrison kept pushing. He connected Gordon Novell, a young electronics expert, to an earlier burglary of a munitions bunker in Houma, Louisiana. Novell, along with Ferry, Arcacha Smith and others, allegedly cut the lock with bolt cutters, looted explosives, and returned to New Orleans. Affidavits tied Novell to the operation, and photographs surfaced of him with a girlfriend who later testified. Novell denied being part of a conspiracy, but his name kept surfacing. Letters written by Novell to contacts in Ohio suggested he had worked for the CIA and was seeking protection. Investigators said he had tried to hide evidence and dodge subpoenas. Garrison wanted him back in Louisiana to face burglary charges and answer questions about the assassination. At the same time, Clay Shaw's defense team prepared to strike back. They planned to quash Garrison's indictment, suppress seized evidence, and subpoena members of Garrison's staff. Powerful New Orleans businessmen tied to Shaw's network were also named. Court battles loomed over every motion, every subpoena, every witness. The national press followed each move. Stories hit the front pages of the Times-Picayune and the States item, while the Associated Press and United Press International wired updates nationwide. Garrison went on ABC television, repeating his claims that Kennedy was killed by a conspiracy of Latin exiles and intelligence operatives. He named Shaw, Ferry, and Oswald as central figures. But as the headlines mounted, so did the resistance. In Texas, Wade and Curry dismissed Garrison's case as baseless. They argued nothing had changed since 1963. Oswald fired the rifle, Ruby killed Oswald, and that was the end of it. Still, Garrison doubled down. He told the public more arrests were coming. He said the investigation would prove a conspiracy that reached into the CIA itself. In New Orleans, the battle lines were clear. On one side stood Garrison, making bold claims and chasing witnesses across state lines. On the other, Dallas lawmen and federal authorities, who insisted the case was closed. The fight over who killed President Kennedy, and why, had become more than a murder investigation. It was now a collision of power, politics, and credibility, played out in courtrooms and headlines across America. On December 10, 1963, John Copperan, news director at WDSU-TV in New Orleans, sat down with the FBI. He laid out what had come across his desk after Kennedy was killed. Anonymous phone calls, linking David Ferry directly to Lee Harvey Oswald. Copperan checked with the Orleans Parish District Attorney's Office. They confirmed it. Ferry was under inquiry and had even been picked up by the police. Ferry's name wasn't just floating in the rumor mill. It was in official files. But Copperan made one thing clear. There was nothing solid tying Ferry to Oswald. What he had was background color. Ferry was a hypnotist, eccentric, the kind of man who collected strange stories around him. Beyond that, it was speculation. Still, the rumors bled into the press. A TV report out of Dallas claimed that Oswald had been seen at Jack Ruby's club, introduced there by Ferry. The entertainer on stage was supposedly a mind reader named Bill DeMar. NBC's Bob Mulholland picked it up in Dallas. Copperan and Mulholland speculated about whether Ferry and Ruby might have crossed paths through the nightclub circuit. But Copperan told the FBI flat out, it was pure guesswork. He had no knowledge of Ferry ever knowing Oswald, Ruby, or DeMar. The FBI didn't leave it there. They went straight to the source. That same day, December 10th, David Ferry typed out his own statement for Agent Regis Kennedy. It read like a man putting up a firewall between himself and the biggest murder in American history. In 1955 or thereabouts, Ferry wrote, I assisted for a time with the Moisant Squadron of Civil Air Patrol. He admitted involvement, but denied remembering Oswald. He claimed he had no records, no recollections that Oswald was ever in his unit. To my best knowledge and belief, he said, I do not know Lee Harvey Oswald. Ferry went point by point. He hadn't been in Dallas nightclubs, not in 15 years. He never met Jack Ruby, and when he was shown Ruby's photograph, he didn't recognize him. He had no acquaintance with Bill DeMar, the mind reader. He knew of no connection whatsoever between Oswald, Ruby, and DeMar. Ferry admitted firearms training at CAP, but minimized it. Simply basic safety instruction for advanced cadets. No telescopic sights, he emphasized. The cadets used their own .22 rifles, nothing sophisticated enough to prepare someone for a presidential assassination. On hypnosis, Ferry leaned into his expertise. He admitted studying it for years but dismissed the idea that hypnotic suggestion could drive someone to kill the president. Without repeated reinforcements, he argued, it couldn't hold. He called the idea absurd. Then Ferry pivoted, aiming at Jack S. Martin, the private investigator who had been talking to anyone who would listen. Martin had been pushing the theory that Ferry hypnotized Oswald to kill Kennedy. Ferry shredded him. Martin, he said, was a fraud. A man who bragged about worthless certificates, who talked up fake degrees. Ferry denied ever distributing those bogus documents and claimed Martin had no credibility. Ferry closed the statement with a final disavowal. I have never known Lee Harvey Oswald or Jack Ruby. Typed, signed, witnessed by an FBI agent. December 10th, 1963. It was the cleanest break Ferry could try to make. A wall of denials delivered under the shadow of the assassination. But in New Orleans, his name kept coming up. Gordon Duane Novell was a ghost who couldn't decide which side of the mirror he wanted to stand on. One day he was CIA, the next day he wasn't. He played both sides with a straight face, and the paper trail he left behind read like the script of a B-movie spy thriller. In May of 1967, CIA headquarters dissected him in a classified memo. Novell had bragged to some people that he was agency, denied it to others, and kept the game alive by feeding stories to the press. NBC was allegedly backing him, maybe even financing him, hoping to build him up as the star witness who could later bring down Jim Garrison's case. To give himself some credibility, Novell exaggerated his ties to Sergio Arcacha Smith, a former exile leader with a reputation in anti-Castro circles. There was even talk he staged a fake ambush in Nashville to make it look like he was being hunted. The agency checked its files. Every division came up empty: RID, CI/CA, security, domestic ops, archives. No trace of Novell. No official record. Nothing to prove he had ever been on their payroll. Yet he kept inserting himself into the story. The press painted him as a 29-year-old electronics man, ex-bar owner, living in the French Quarter one day, and in a cheap apartment in Columbus, Ohio, the next. He drove a used car with dealer tags, always moving, always hustling. When the FBI got wind of him, he was hanging around McLean, Virginia, spook country, taking polygraphs from a private detective named Lloyd Ferr. Ferr's firm, REDEX, was notorious for shady counter-audio gear and described in government files as unscrupulous and untrustworthy. Novell's connections ran in strange directions. On March 29, 1967, he phoned the FBI in New Orleans and made a cryptic remark. He hadn't given Garrison any information about Double Check, a Cuban operation in Miami. He didn't explain what Double Check was, but intelligence officers later tied it to Double Check, a shell company that had funneled money to Bay of Pigs flyers' families. When pressed, Novell insisted he had worked for the CIA. He told reporters that he and Arcacha raided a munitions bunker in Houma, Louisiana, and took bomb casings for the agency. He claimed his CIA handler sent him to work at an ad agency called Evergreen, a supposed front for CIA propaganda. He said he had produced special radio commercials coded with phrases like star Christmas trees and holiday trees, cues for Cuban exiles gearing up for the invasion. CIA files told a different story. Evergreen was never theirs. No record of contracts. No link to Novell. His lawyers didn't back him up either. One called his claims utterly ridiculous. Another refused to confirm or deny anything. Novell himself contradicted his own story, telling a Columbus reporter in April 1967, "The statements that I worked for the CIA are absolutely incorrect." But then he'd go back on the record again, claiming he was a middleman between the CIA and the Cuban exile underground. His New Orleans attorney, Steve Plotkin, admitted Novell had served as a go-between for anti-Castro groups, but insisted he had nothing to do with Kennedy's assassination. Meanwhile, Novell fed the FBI sensational predictions. He said Garrison would soon accuse Clay Shaw of holding letters linking Oswald to David Ferry, Ferry to Ruby, and even Robert Kennedy to Ferry. He hinted at typewriters Ferry supposedly owned, a Soviet connection through Garrison's investigator, William Gurvich, and a buried link to an attorney named Leighton Martins. Each time he called, he added another twist. The game escalated. By May 1967, Garrison went on the attack, accusing Novell's attorneys of being paid off by the CIA. He told the press, "Every lawyer involved in this case, without exception, has been connected with the Central Intelligence Agency. Novell didn't shrink from the spotlight." On May 22nd, he claimed he'd been ambushed in Nashville. He and a friend, Gary Edwards, said snipers had fired at their truck outside a radio station. The glass was shattered, bullets had supposedly grazed them, but police couldn't make sense of the scene. Edwards fled to Washington under another name. The whole thing smelled staged. A week later, Novell fired off a sarcastic telegram to CIA Director Richard Helms. "Today, according to the Jolly Green Giant, Mr. Garrison, you are paying my legal fees in Louisiana and Ohio." When reporters asked him point-blank about his agency ties, he played coy, joking about his attorneys not being paid, threatening to sue the CIA bad guys in accounting for welching on debts. It was theatre, part comedy, part threat. Behind the curtain, files suggested Novell had once been an FBI informant. Reports tied him loosely to the Hoomer munitions raid alongside Arkasha and David Ferrie. Witnesses claimed he used his own Lincoln to haul equipment. It was the same pattern over and over again. Novell hovering at the edges of real operations, half in, half out, leaving just enough smoke to convince the audience there was fire. By the end of May 1967, Novell was still on the loose, still on the phone, still tossing gasoline on Garrison's investigation. To the CIA, he had a headache. To the FBI, a possible informant. To the press, a mystery man. But to Jim Garrison, Gordon Novell was the thread that tied everything to Langley, and Novell made sure nobody stopped talking about him. June 1967. The agency had reached its breaking point with Jim Garrison. An internal CIA memorandum labeled secret pulled no punches. Garrison's allegations were the grossest we have seen from any responsible American official. His TV appearances on May 21st and May 28th weren't just local noise. They were national, vicious, and dangerous. The memo admitted flatly Garrison had translated his probe into a ward healer's fight in the worst domestic political tradition. To Langley, this was no longer about one DA in New Orleans. It was about protecting the agency's existence. Garrison went on camera, accusing the CIA of 6 crimes. David Ferry and Lee Harvey Oswald had worked for the agency. CIA was conspiring to hide the truth of Kennedy's murder. Kennedy had been killed by CYA employees. CIA was blocking Garrison's investigation. The agency was abusing its power, endangering democracy. CIA should be gutted, curtailed, or destroyed. He didn't whisper it. He hammered it into living rooms across the country. He declared that Ferry had been a CIA pilot, that Oswald wasn't some lone wolf Marxist, but an anti-communist connected to Langley. Garrison pointed to Oswald's fluency in Russian, his easy access to a Soviet visa, his military background at Atsugi, Japan, home to top-secret U-2 operations. He asked the public, how does a Marine dropout pick up Russian overnight, unless he's trained by intelligence? Garrison tied Oswald's entire career to the CIA. Even Oswald's address book, he said, carried the number of the local agency office. If you add up his conduct, Garrison said, there's no question about it. The accusations escalated. He charged that CIA's criminal activities had begun immediately after the assassination, blocking the FBI and covering up New Orleans connections to Oswald. He told viewers bluntly, Kennedy was killed by men on the CIA payroll. Cubans bitter from the Bay of Pigs, trained and guided in New Orleans in the summer of '63. They know the names, Garrison said on national television. They know who pulled the triggers from the grassy knoll and the stockade fence. And they know that they did it because they were former employees of the CIA. His words detonated. To the public, Garrison was dropping bombs. To the CIA, he was waging war. He accused the agency of withholding evidence, hiding the identities of assassins, and blocking justice in Louisiana. He said lawyers like Gordon Novell, Sergio Arcacha Smith, and Alvin Beauboeuf were agency pawns, paid to disrupt his case. He told reporters, every lawyer in this case, without exception, is connected to the CIA. The agency recognized the danger immediately. Another secret memo warned, both singly and in their totality, Garrison's allegations warrant timely, energetic counteraction. For the CIA, this was no longer about New Orleans. Garrison had declared the agency itself a criminal enterprise, a totalitarian power undermining democracy, more dangerous than the Gestapo or the NKVD. On TV, he told the country, the CIA has fantastic power. It does not have to account for its funds. It has infinitely more power than the Gestapo. Its power must be stripped. He demanded Congress dismantle the agency. "The end justifies the means," Garrison said, quoting the CIA's alleged philosophy. "That's why it should be eliminated." Inside Langley, alarm bells went off. What Garrison was pushing wasn't just a trial. It was a public execution of the CIA's legitimacy. By the fall of 1967, the war over who killed John F. Kennedy was no longer just about Dallas. It had shifted to New Orleans, Miami, and Washington, where courtroom battles, press leaks, and secret memos created a second front as bitter as the first. Jim Garrison, the New Orleans district attorney, was still the only public official willing to say it flat out. The CIA was involved in killing the president. His TV appearances and interviews had made him a national figure, but also a national target. His case against Clay Shaw, businessman, international trademark director, and alleged covert operator, was facing delays, pressure from Washington, and an orchestrated smear campaign in the press. Behind the scenes, the Justice Department and CIA were scrambling. On September 21, 1967, Clay Shaw's defense attorneys, Irvin Diamond and Edward Wegman, walked into the Department of Justice to quietly ask for help. They wanted confirmation on whether Shaw, Oswald, Ferry, and a cast of others had ever been connected to the agency. The list was long: Donald Norton, Gordon Novell, Burton Klein, Lee Odom, even the Wegmans themselves. Anything to undercut Garrison's case. Justice listened, but gave no promises. CIA General Counsel Lawrence Houston drafted secret memos warning that Garrison's investigation was twisting routine associations into a story of agency conspiracy. He instructed his people not to just check official records, but to also consider social contacts, cocktail parties, chance meetings, any little thread Garrison might spin into a rope. "Knowing Garrison," Houston wrote, "do not restrict yourself." The agency wasn't just on defense. It was planning counterattacks. In October, Houston sent a letter to the Justice Department tying Garrison's investigation to the Rolando Masfera case in Miami, where anti-Castro Cubans stood trial for plotting to invade Haiti. The point was clear. Garrison was treading the same ground as Cuban exile militants, some of whom had past associations with CIA. If the Miami case blew up, the Shaw trial might have to be postponed, sparing Shaw and sparing the agency the heat. Meanwhile, people around the conspiracy began turning up dead. On February 22, 1967, David Ferry was found dead in New Orleans. That same day, Eladio del Valle, a Cuban exile and known associate of Ferry, was murdered in Miami, shot in the heart and axed in the head. Garrison had named both Ferry and del Valle as conspirators with Oswald. Now both were silenced. Garrison told reporters he'd lost valuable witnesses. The CIA insisted del Valle had never worked for them, though memos admitted he was closely tied to Masfera and his exile network. Privately, some suspected his killing was meant to prevent him from exposing sensitive operations. The press war raged on. National outlets hammered Garrison for lack of hard evidence, accusing him of circus tactics, grandstanding, and reckless innuendo. The Charlotte Observer dismissed his work as cheap, vulgar show. The CIA quietly helped push the line that Garrison was using Soviet-style propaganda. Even his Playboy interview, where Garrison laid out his case that former CIA employees had pulled the triggers in Dallas, was mocked by critics as self-promotion. But not everyone was buying the official story. In Moscow, a US defector named John Smith told the Soviet press that Kennedy had been killed in a CIA-linked conspiracy. In Miami, State Attorney Richard Gerstein went public, saying Garrison's evidence was serious enough to warrant a congressional inquiry into CIA activities. Still, the countercurrent was strong. In October, Lee Oswald's brother Robert broke his silence in Look magazine. He backed the Warren Commission, saying he had seen no evidence of conspiracy. He believed his brother alone had killed Kennedy. Back in New Orleans, Garrison was defiant. In interviews, he described Shaw not as a respectable businessman, but as a queen bee of the city's gay underground, with ties to Oswald and Ferry. Perry Russo, a young insurance salesman, testified he'd been at a meeting where Shaw, Oswald and Ferry discussed killing Kennedy. To Garrison, it was proof of conspiracy. To his critics, it was hearsay propped up by hypnosis. By late 1967, the stage was set. On one side, a district attorney pushing the case that Kennedy's death was the product of a CIA-backed plot involving Cuban exiles, Oswald, and Clay Shaw. On the other, the combined weight of the federal government, the intelligence community, and a press corps primed to tear him apart. The jury would not be seated for months, but the verdict in the court of public opinion was already being written. Men. By the fall of 1967, Jim Garrison was no longer whispering his theory. He was shouting it from the rooftops. To him, the assassination of President Kennedy wasn't the work of a lone gunman. It was a military-style operation, carried out by professionals, men who had once drawn paychecks from the CIA. In interviews and press conferences, he hammered the same point. Oswald was a decoy, a patsy planted in the middle of a larger conspiracy. The president was assassinated by a precision guerrilla team of at least 7 men, Garrison said. He wasn't hedging anymore. He wasn't saying maybe or possibly. He was raising the stakes, insisting that Oswald never fired a single shot in Dealey Plaza. He broke it down with the detail of a battlefield report. There were at least 4 men on the grassy knoll, he claimed, 2 behind the picket fence, 2 more crouched near a stone wall. 1 fired, another collected the spent cartridges. Behind Kennedy, at least 2 more shooters fired from high ground. 1 from the book depository. Another, he argued, in all probability from the Daltex building. In his version, bullets were flying from 3 sides of the plaza. The Warren Commission verdict is a lie, he told Playboy. Oswald didn't kill Kennedy. He was used as a scapegoat. Garrison traced the conspiracy back to New Orleans. He said the CIA had been training Cuban exiles, Minutemen, and assorted right-wing adventurers north of Lake Pontchartrain. When Kennedy began moving toward peace with Cuba and the Soviet Union, those same men turned their anger on him. The key figure in the peace talks was Lisa Howard, a TV reporter who had secretly met with Che Guevara to help broker a dialogue between Washington and Havana. She died of an overdose of sleeping pills in July 1965. Garrison called her death suspicious. She was a channel between Bobby Kennedy and Cuba, he said. And she's gone. In Garrison's telling, the conspiracy had been born in frustration. The CIA built an army of exiles for an invasion of Cuba. When Kennedy refused to give them the green light, the paramilitary network collapsed inward, pointing its guns back at him. Jack Ruby, Oswald, and other familiar New Orleans names were already part of the picture. Ruby's ties to Dallas police officers gave the guerrillas cover. Radio equipment and insider support, Garrison argued, made it almost impossible for them to get caught. He described it as, essentially, a Nazi operation. Oil money and hard-right extremists supplied the cash. Ex-CIA operators and mercenaries provided the muscle. John F. Kennedy was assassinated by armed ultra-militant paramilitary elements who were patriotic in a psychotic sense, Garrison said. He promised more arrests. He promised the truth would surface when Clay Shaw finally went to trial. And when critics accused him of grandstanding, he shrugged it off. All I can say is this is an ongoing case, he said, and there will be more arrests. The Warren Commission had given America 1 gunman, firing from 1 building. Garrison was giving them 7 killers, firing from 3 sides in a coordinated killbox. To him, the choice was clear. Either believe the Commission's red herring or believe that Kennedy was gunned down in Dallas by a guerrilla team of CIA-trained soldiers. And he was betting his career, and maybe his freedom, that the second story was the truth. New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison didn't mince words. In a Playboy interview, he laid it out flat. President Kennedy wasn't murdered by a lone drifter with a rifle. He was taken out by a precision guerrilla team, at least 7 men, all with past ties to the CIA. Lee Harvey Oswald, Garrison said, was nothing but a patsy. The real shooters were part of a right-wing paramilitary conspiracy trained in the swamps north of New Orleans. Minutemen, Cuban exiles, anti-Castro adventurers. They made up the mixed bag Garrison claimed the CIA had been grooming for years. These weren't amateurs. They were soldiers of fortune, mercenaries with political backing. Jack Ruby, Oswald, and a host of New Orleans residents were already in Garrison's files as tied to the conspiracy. When Kennedy cut a deal with the Soviets not to invade Cuba, the game changed. The CIA pulled back, support dried up, and the operatives, now trained, armed, and furious, turned their sights on a new target. Kennedy became the enemy. The Minutemen leadership shot back. Robert Depew, their head man, denied everything. He called Garrison's charge slander, an attempt to smear good Americans. He admitted some Minutemen were Dallas cops, but that didn't make them killers. Garrison, in a taped radio interview, doubled down. The Minutemen, he said, were tremendously involved, and Dallas police tied to them were waist-deep in the conspiracy. The firefight between Garrison and the Minutemen played out in headlines. Statements flew. Kennedy was murdered by a communist assassin, Depew insisted. But Garrison wasn't letting go. He claimed Nazi sympathizers and oil-rich psychotic millionaires had bankrolled the hit. The assassins, he said, were radio-equipped, coordinated, and had zero risk of being caught. Then came the pushback from the top. Chief Justice Earl Warren, fresh from Tokyo, declared he had seen no new evidence. He stood by the commission's lone gunman verdict and accused Garrison of trying to dynamite the case. To Warren, Oswald acted alone. To Garrison, the Warren report was the biggest fraud ever sold to the American people. Garrison hit back hard. He said Warren's reassurances were nothing but political cover. The men and the agencies who have participated in fooling the citizens of this country, he said, are going to sit idly by while a country prosecutor brings out the truth. He was convinced Washington was sabotaging his case before it ever reached trial. By September 1967, the media circus was full-blown. Ramparts magazine torched CBS for its 4-night special on the Warren Report, calling it a whitewash dressed up as journalism. CBS had staged experiments with rifles, mannequins, and even slabs of cadavers to sell the magic bullet theory. Critics called it fraud. They accused CBS of cutting tapes, silencing contradictions, and using camera tricks to stretch Zapruder's film from 5.3 seconds to over 9. The network's credibility tanked, but for the establishment, the damage control was done. In Washington, congressional hearings kept the fight alive. Garrison's allies grilled witnesses, floated the CIA's role, and hammered at the contradictions in the Warren Commission's case. Could Oswald really have fired all the shots? Was Jack Ruby just a strip club hustler who lost it? Or was he silencing the fall guy on orders? The Metropolitan Crime Commission in New Orleans piled on next. They wanted the governor and attorney general to investigate Garrison himself, calling his probe reckless, his methods dishonest. They pointed to reports of bribery, intimidation, even attempts to pressure witnesses into perjury. Their message was clear. Shut him down. But Garrison didn't blink. He told anyone who'd listen that the assassins weren't ghosts. They were real men, trained and funded, many of them connected to the CIA, the Minutemen, and the Dallas police. He said they had been soldiers in a private war against Castro, and when Kennedy turned off their war, they turned their guns on him. The fight had become bigger than Kennedy's murder. It was about who controlled the story, Washington and the networks, or a district attorney in New Orleans who claimed he'd seen the truth. And Garrison wasn't done. He promised names, he promised arrests, and he promised that when the time came, the American people would finally see the bullets weren't fired by one man in a sixth-floor window, but by a team of killers hiding in the shadows. By the summer of '67, Jim Garrison's probe was a battlefield. His investigation into Kennedy's murder had become a high-wire act where every move was met with resistance, ridicule, or open sabotage. Newspapers turned his case into front-page theatre, while the courtroom battles played out like a prize fight with the odds stacked against him. The Senate hearings gave him a national platform, but it was hostile territory. Critics lined up to tear him down, saying his theories were stitched together with rumour and paranoia. CBS had aired its polished Warren Report special, hammering home that Oswald acted alone. Their magic bullet reenactments, though shaky, were broadcast into millions of homes, drowning Garrison's voice in skepticism. The establishment was circling the wagons. Still, he pressed forward. He had a witness list, shaky but explosive. Perry Russo, swearing under oath that David Ferry and Clay Shaw plotted Kennedy's death. Jack Ruby's connections to the Dallas police and organized crime, and whispers of CIA involvement stretching from Miami to Mexico City. Garrison tied them together with one word: conspiracy. But every step forward triggered blowback. The Louisiana Supreme Court ruled TV journalist Walter Sheridan had to testify before Garrison's grand jury. Sheridan, NBC's man on the scene, wasn't just covering the story. He was accused of trying to sabotage it. Sheridan painted Garrison as a reckless showman, and in return the DA branded him part of a cover-up. Meanwhile, witnesses were slipping through Garrison's fingers. Dean Andrews, the flamboyant attorney who had once tied Oswald to the mysterious Clay Bertrand, now taunted Garrison in public. Indicted for perjury, Andrews mocked the DA as a bully who was wasting the city's time. His warning was blunt: "Mess with me one more time and I'll file charges against you." Even within Garrison's own camp, cracks were showing. Bill Gurvich, a private detective who'd once been his right-hand man, jumped ship. Gurvich told reporters there was no case against Shaw, calling Garrison's theories irrational. His defection was a public relations disaster, giving Garrison's enemies ammunition to claim his entire probe was a sham. And then there was David Ferry, found dead in his apartment, officially ruled a natural death. To Garrison, it reeked of silence. Perry Russo told anyone who would listen that Ferry had bragged about knowing ways to commit the perfect murder, even with chemicals that could fool an autopsy. Ferry's death cut a gaping hole in the DA's theory, but it also fed suspicions that someone somewhere was cleaning house. Letters to the editor in the Times-Picayune hammered Garrison too. Alton Oxner, head of the Information Council of the Americas, blasted him for undermining trust in the CIA and FBI. To Oxner, Oswald was a known communist, and any attempt to shift blame onto US intelligence was not just misguided, it was dangerous. Garrison fired back in his own way. He told reporters the CIA had hidden 51 classified documents on Oswald, Ruby, and Cuba. He accused the agency of knowing far more than it admitted, and of obstructing justice by keeping those files under lock and key. If he couldn't break them in court, he'd try to break them in the press. The case had become a war of attrition. Each day brought another headline, another twist. Andrews threatening to sue, Sheridan dodging subpoenas, Gurvich defecting, Ferry dead, and Clay Shaw waiting for trial. And through it all, Garrison doubled down. He told anyone who'd listen that Oswald didn't fire a single shot on November 22nd, 1963. The real shooters were trained guerrillas, tied to the CIA, Cuban exiles, and right-wing extremists. Kennedy's death wasn't the act of a lone nut. It was the product of an organized hit, born in the shadows and protected at the highest levels of power. By July, the Labour Monthly out of Britain was publishing articles that echoed Garrison's charges. CIA, fingerprints all over, the Dallas hit. To Garrison, it was validation. To his enemies, it was further proof he had crossed into conspiracy fantasy. But Big Jim didn't care. He saw himself in a fight to the death, with the Warren Commission, with the CIA, with the very machinery of the US government. His critics said he was delusional, paranoid, maybe even dangerous. But for Garrison, it was simple. He believed the truth was out there. And if he had to burn down the house to prove it, so be it. By the summer of 1967, Jim Garrison's war was no longer just in the courtroom. It was on every front page, every television broadcast, and every whisper that made its way from Washington to New Orleans. His claim that Kennedy was killed by a conspiracy involving CIA-backed paramilitaries, anti-Castro Cubans, and right-wing extremists wasn't just radical, it was radioactive. And the establishment was circling its wagons. CBS rolled out its 4-night special on the Warren Report. Walter Cronkite, the nation's most trusted voice, calmly told millions of Americans there was no real evidence of a conspiracy. Lee Harvey Oswald, Cronkite repeated, was a loner, a misfit who acted alone. Still, Cronkite couldn't dismiss Garrison outright. He admitted there might be a lunatic fringe in dark and devious conspiracy, but CBS left viewers with one clear conclusion. Garrison had nothing that could hold up in court. Meanwhile, Mike Wallace grilled Garrison in a nationally televised interview. Why hadn't he turned his evidence over to the feds? Wallace asked. Garrison's answer was sharp. Because in Washington, there were individuals who do not want the truth about the Kennedy murder to come out. He named the Justice Department and the CIA. Wallace pressed. Was he accusing the federal government of blocking justice? Absolutely, Garrison shot back. That same week, William Gurvich, Garrison's former chief investigator, broke ranks. Gurvich called Garrison's case a hoax. He claimed there was no basis for indicting Shaw and that his former boss was misleading the public. Gurvich told anyone who would listen that Shaw should never have been arrested. His defection was devastating. Gurvich had been inside the case from the beginning. Now he was saying flat out that Garrison was perpetrating a fraud. The FBI and the CIA stayed quiet, but their silence only fueled Garrison's fire. He said Gurvich's betrayal proved how deep the conspiracy ran. NBC and the Columbia Broadcasting System both ran investigations that, like CBS, reaffirmed the Warren Report's findings. No conspiracy. Oswald alone. To Garrison, the media was no longer just biased. It was complicit. He accused the Eastern press of colluding with intelligence agencies to bury the truth. Then came Perry Russo, the young insurance salesman turned star witness. NBC cameras had captured his testimony, and according to Russo, the network twisted his words to discredit him. He insisted he told the truth, that he had witnessed Shaw, Oswald, and David Ferry plotting Kennedy's murder. He accused NBC of using absolute trial tactics to sabotage Garrison's probe. NBC hit back. Executives flatly denied Russo's charges. They said he was confused, unstable, and prone to fantasy. They even floated that he may have been manipulated by Garrison's team. But behind the denials, Russo claimed NBC reporters had tried to cut deals with him. Offers of jobs, relocation, even guarantees of safety if he backed away from Garrison. He refused, and in doing so became both a liability and the DA's last hope of tying Shaw to a conspiracy. As the national networks dismantled him, Garrison doubled down. He went public with his most explosive claim yet. The CIA itself had infiltrated New Orleans, and Oswald had been one of its agents. The agency, he said, had infinitely more power than the Gestapo and the NKVD combined. They were blocking him at every turn. Critics called him paranoid. The Oregonian printed that skepticism was healthy, but Garrison had gone too far, attacking the Warren Report with no credible evidence. The Stamford advocate mocked him, saying no rational citizen should take his case seriously. Other papers, like the Newsday and the Charleston Gazette, suggested he was caving under tremendous federal pressure, but couldn't admit his case was crumbling. Behind it all, Judge Edward Haggerty tried to keep order. He warned lawyers not to leak to the press, not to poison the jury pool. But it was too late. The Shaw case had become a trial in the court of public opinion, long before it ever reached the courtroom. Garrison was now both prosecutor and defendant, trying Clay Shaw in New Orleans while fighting a national smear campaign that painted him as delusional, paranoid, and power-hungry. He wasn't just up against Shaw's lawyers anymore. He was up against CBS, NBC, the FBI, and the CIA. And as he told reporters in June of '67, with his voice low and deliberate, "There is not enough money in the United States Treasury, and not enough printer's ink in the country to keep us from developing the facts about the murder of President Kennedy." The DA wasn't backing down. But neither was the establishment. The battle lines were drawn. By the summer of 1967, Jim Garrison's crusade had turned into a national spectacle. He was no longer just a district attorney. He was a showman with a stage, and the stage was the Kennedy assassination. Max Lerner described Garrison as obsessed, almost consumed. The DA spoke of two phases in the supposed conspiracy. Phase 1, David Ferry and Clay Shaw plotting to kill Kennedy. Phase 2, orders from higher up, from Castro enemies, maybe even the CIA, to convert the plot into a larger anti-Castro drive. Garrison spoke as though Oswald were never more than a patsy, a pawn in a rigged game run by powerful masters who wanted Castro dead or Kennedy out of the way. When Lerner sat down with him in his New Orleans home, Garrison spoke endlessly, pacing and circling like a man rehearsing for trial. He laid out theories, detailed maps, pointed to triangulated gunfire, and spoke of Oswald's homosexual group associations. His tone was clinical but fevered. He insisted Oswald didn't fire a shot, that he was placed in position as bait, a decoy. The masters, Garrison said, needed someone to hang it on. US News and World Report captured the broader stir. Millions of Americans, they wrote, were beginning to wonder if the official story of Dallas was a fraud. Garrison's televised charges about Oswald's ties and the possibility of a conspiracy made headlines across the country. His May broadcast hammered the Warren report. Oswald didn't act alone. He may not have even acted at all. But where was the proof? Garrison had seized witnesses, like Perry Russo, who placed Shaw, Ferry, and Oswald in a September 1963 meeting to plot Kennedy's murder. He leaned on Ferry's strange death, on Shaw's alias, Clay Bertrand, and on Oswald's mysterious connections. Yet, time and again, the Warren Commission's findings undercut him. The commission said Oswald's palm prints were on the murder weapon. Witnesses saw him bring the rifle to work. Fibers from his clothing matched those on the gun. There was no evidence of another gunman firing from the grassy knoll. Garrison countered with theatrics. He told reporters that Jack Ruby wasn't just a strip club owner with mob ties. He was part of the conspiracy, linked to Oswald. He said the CIA had infiltrated the plot and covered its tracks. When asked for hard evidence, he repeated the same refrain. The federal government was withholding the truth. The press began to turn. Articles in the Courier Post and the Joplin Globe mocked Garrison's probe as show business, accusing him of chasing headlines and swapping theories like playing cards. One week it was the CIA, the next week anti-Castro Cubans, then Jack Ruby, then a phantom group of two-man teams of killers who fired frangible bullets that supposedly disintegrated on contact. The problem, critics said, was that no bullets or cartridges had ever been found to support the claim. Garrison's answer was always the same. Of course there was no evidence. The conspirators were too smart to leave it behind. By June, his war with the media and Washington was full-blown. He accused the FBI, CIA, Secret Service, and even the Eastern press of actively sabotaging his investigation. NBC, CBS, and the Associated Press hammered back, defending the Warren report and branding Garrison's charges baseless. A Harris poll showed 1 in 4 Americans now believed in some conspiracy, but critics argued this was Garrison's circus talking, nothing more. Still, the DA doubled down. He leaned on the drama, claiming Ferry had been silenced before he could talk. He pressed the case against Shaw as the mastermind, Clay Bertrand, though Shaw denied it flatly. And he painted the CIA as the invisible hand orchestrating everything. William Turner, writing in The Inquest, captured the larger picture. Garrison believed a small circle of anti-Castro Cubans, CIA assets, and organized crime had come together, with Oswald as the expendable pawn. It wasn't a grand conspiracy, he argued, but a tightly controlled one. The people who engineered the killing, Garrison declared, are still walking around today. Despite the criticism, Garrison gained political backing. In late May, the Mississippi House passed resolutions urging governors in Ohio, Texas, and Iowa to speed up the extradition of witnesses he had subpoenaed. Gordon Novel, one of those targets, accused Garrison of fabricating stories and sued him for harassment. Novel even mocked the DA in a letter to CIA Director Richard Helms, joking that Garrison called him the Jolly Green Giant and was claiming the agency was paying his legal fees. The press ate it up. Columnists derided Garrison as paranoid, a charlatan. But the DA wouldn't budge. To him, the pushback proved only one thing. He was right, and they were scared. As May turned to June, Garrison wasn't backing down. He was tightening his circle, sharpening his attacks, and betting everything on making the Shaw trial his stage. To critics, it was a circus. To Garrison, it was history in the making, and he was the only man brave enough to tell it. By late May 1967, Jim Garrison's case had become more than a courtroom drama. It was a street fight played out in headlines, television spots, and backroom whispers. He wasn't just up against Clay Shaw and a team of defense attorneys. He was staring down the FBI, the CIA, and the entire weight of the federal government. The Warren Commission had delivered its verdict. Oswald acted alone. But Garrison's files painted another picture, one of Cuban exiles, disgruntled former CIA operatives, and New Orleans businessmen tied together by a Bay of Pigs hangover. His public statements grew bolder. Lee Harvey Oswald never fired a shot in Dallas, and Jack Ruby didn't just happen to kill Oswald. Both were pieces on a board, moved by unseen hands. The problem was the evidence, or rather, the lack of it. Witnesses flipped, leads dried up, and what little material Garrison had was slipping away. When pressed, he claimed it wasn't incompetence, but sabotage. "The real assassins can't be located," he said, "because the CIA is making every effort to block me." That didn't stop him from making the case in the court of public opinion. He floated theories like a card dealer at a smoky table, two-man sniper teams, bullet shells that vanished because second shooters picked them up, and even frangible bullets that disintegrated on impact, leaving no trace. It was sleight of hand mixed with courtroom theatre. Critics called it show business. Some said Disneyland should hire him. But Garrison insisted it was the only way to explain the holes in the Warren report. Clay Shaw, the New Orleans businessman accused of conspiring with Oswald and David Ferry, waited for trial while his lawyers battled to discredit every word. Judge Edward Haggerty, presiding over the Shaw case, tightened his grip. He announced stiffened guidelines for press statements, warning that anyone, prosecutors, defense attorneys or reporters, who went too far risked contempt of court. The message was clear: keep the circus outside his courtroom. Still, Garrison pressed on. He told television audiences more arrests were coming, "We are going to have to defer any other arrests until later," he admitted, blaming the bombardment of his office by artillery fire. But he promised to connect Jack Ruby to the conspiracy, saying it would be very easy to do. Then came Gordon Novell, a shadowy figure with ties to electronics work for the CIA. Garrison wanted him extradited, naming him a key witness. Novell fled, claiming he was being set up. From Columbus, Ohio, he mocked the DA, saying Garrison had finally fallen into the last trap. A mysterious letter, supposedly linking Novell to the CIA, surfaced, but his lawyer dismissed it as a fraud. Novell went further, suing Garrison and accusing him of fabricating evidence. Meanwhile, Dallas law enforcement pushed back hard. Police officials who'd been there in '63 went on record. Oswald fired the shots, no one else. They scoffed at talk of guerrilla teams and CIA plots. "I never did run into any encouragement of Oswald," one officer told the press. The FBI added its voice, identifying Oswald's rifle and dismissing the rest as smoke and mirrors. But Garrison had one more card. Oswald as a possible double agent. He pointed to Oswald's quick return from the Soviet Union, his ease in getting a passport, his suspicious Mexico City trip. Was Oswald CIA? Or KGB? Or both? To Garrison, the contradictions screamed intelligence work. Much of the mystery of the Warren report would be explained if Oswald were a double agent, one column noted. By now, Garrison wasn't just prosecuting Shaw, he was putting the Warren Commission itself on trial. Every interview, every court filing, every press appearance became another strike at what he called the official lie. Supporters saw him as a man exposing a cover-up of historic proportions. Critics saw a showman spinning theories out of smoke. Either way, the story wasn't going away. The battle lines were drawn: New Orleans versus Washington, Garrison versus the establishment, and the ghost of Lee Harvey Oswald caught in the middle. In New Orleans, Jim Garrison was no longer just a district attorney. He was turning himself into the last man standing against the Warren report. With every press conference, every leak, he raised the stakes. And by May of 1967, the story he was pushing had shifted into something bigger, louder, and harder to ignore. He now declared Lee Harvey Oswald didn't fire a shot in Dallas. The killing of President John F. Kennedy, Garrison insisted, was the work of guerrilla fighters, anti-Castro adventurers who cut him down in a crossfire. They had previously been CIA employees, he said flatly, pointing his finger directly at the agency. The claim was simple. The CIA knew exactly who killed Kennedy. Pure and simple, Garrison told the press. It's a case of former employees of the CIA, a large number of them Cubans, angry over the Bay of Pigs, joined by certain individuals with a fusion of interests Oswald. He wasn't a killer. He was a decoy. The president, Garrison said, was killed by at least 2 pairs of men, positioned in front and behind, their shots converging in Dealey Plaza. One bullet, he insisted, had come from the front. Another man was in the back, shooting too. The president was killed by a bullet fired from the front, he repeated, hammering it home. And he added another layer. The role of the second man in each case was to pick up the actual cartridges, taken on the bounce, so that the cartridges could be disposed of as quickly as the guns. It was, he argued, a precision operation, a guerrilla team, and to make sure there was no trace, they used frangible bullets, rounds designed to shatter into tiny pieces, leaving nothing behind. The Warren Commission, Garrison said, either didn't know or didn't want to know. He accused the CIA of concealing the whereabouts of the real assassins. His rhetoric grew bolder. It's quite obvious who they were, because they had previously been CIA employees. By this point, Garrison had turned the investigation into a war with the federal government. He claimed the FBI and CIA had collaborated to cover up Oswald's involvement with anti-Castro Cubans. He told audiences that the CIA knew the names of every man involved and the individuals who pulled the triggers from the grassy knoll and the stone wall. But there was a catch. The louder Garrison shouted, the more people demanded proof. "If Garrison has any facts," wrote one editorial, "then it's time he reveals them. Otherwise it's time for him to put up or shut up." Meanwhile, the pressure on witnesses grew. Carlos Quiroga, a Cuban exile tied to Garrison's circle, was called before a grand jury. So was Gordon Novel, who fought extradition from Ohio while mocking Garrison in the press. Novel's enemies claimed he was CIA. Novel himself dismissed the charge, at one point writing a letter Garrison called the last trap. And through it all, Garrison never let go of the bigger story. Kennedy was not killed by Oswald, but by a network of Cuban exiles, American mercenaries, and intelligence veterans furious over the Bay of Pigs and Kennedy's attempts at détente with Castro. "This is the Cuban adventure," Garrison declared, "and the venomous reaction from those committed to an adventure in Cuba." He promised more arrests. He hinted at proof that never came. And each time he went before the microphones, he made sure of one thing. The official story was dead, and his version, however explosive, was the only one worth listening to. By the summer of '67, Jim Garrison wasn't just a district attorney anymore. He was a man at war, with Washington, with the CIA, with the Warren Commission, with anyone who said Lee Harvey Oswald killed the president, alone. He told the press straight, Oswald never fired a shot. Kennedy was taken down in a crossfire. Guerrilla fighters, anti-Castro adventurers, men who, he claimed, had once drawn CIA paychecks. "Pure and simple," he said. "It's a case of former employees of the CIA, a large number of them Cubans, burning with revenge after the Bay of Pigs." According to Garrison, Dealey Plaza wasn't the scene of a lone gunman. It was a kill zone. At least 2 pairs of shooters, one team in front, one in back. One bullet from the front tore into Kennedy. Another man in the rear fired too. "The president was killed by a bullet fired from the front," Garrison insisted, hammering it like gospel. "And the shooters," he said, "weren't sloppy. They had second men whose job was to scoop up the spent shells before anyone could find them. No cartridges, no evidence. On top of that, they used frangible bullets, rounds that shattered on impact, leaving no trace. Forbidden by the Geneva Treaty," Garrison said, "but used for an assassination. It was," he argued, "a precision operation. A guerrilla team carrying out a military mission, cool and disciplined. The CIA," Garrison charged, "wasn't just aware, it was covering for them, concealing the whereabouts of the men who had done it. It's obvious who they were," he said. "They'd been CIA employees." To him, Oswald was the perfect Patsy, a throwaway decoy set up to take the blame. The Warren Commission, he declared, was either blind or complicit. They didn't want to know, he told anyone who'd listen. But the louder he got, the more people demanded receipts. "If Garrison has any facts," one editorial snapped, "it's time he shows them." Otherwise, put up or shut up, his witnesses didn't make things easier. Carlos Quiroga, a Cuban exile tied to his case, got hauled in front of a grand jury. Gordon Novel fought extradition from Ohio, mocking Garrison every step of the way. Novel called the whole thing a circus. Garrison called him CIA. At one point, Novel produced a letter Garrison labeled "The Last Trap." Still, Garrison pushed forward. "This is the Cuban adventure," he declared. The venomous reaction from those committed to an adventure in Cuba. Every appearance, every press leak, he promised more arrests, more evidence, more secrets about blowing. Proof never seemed to come, but that didn't stop him. In the end, Garrison's message was simple. The official story was dead. Oswald didn't kill Kennedy. The CIA knew who did. And until someone proved otherwise, his version, explosive, messy, and unfinished, was the only story worth listening to. Jim Garrison sat across from the reporters, voice sharp, tone defiant. Lee Harvey Oswald did not kill President John F. Kennedy, he said. The Central Intelligence Agency knows who did. It was May 1967, and Garrison was no longer just the New Orleans district attorney. He had become the lone figure willing to say out loud what most men in power only whispered. He told the press that Oswald never even touched a gun in Dealey Plaza. The real killers, he claimed, were 5 anti-Castro Cubans, men consumed by rage over Kennedy's handling of the Bay of Pigs. And behind them, Garrison said, was the CIA orchestrating everything while burying the truth under layers of secrecy. On local television, he hammered his point home. The CIA is more powerful than the Gestapo ever was, he told viewers. They know the names of every Cuban involved. He promised he could solve the assassination in 60 minutes if the agency turned over the evidence. But they wouldn't. Instead, the CIA built what Garrison called a glass wall, blocking him at every turn. He pointed to photographs. Grainy shots, he claimed, showed armed men behind the grassy knoll and stone wall. 5 of them not distinct enough for identification, he admitted. But they're there. Witnesses had been intimidated, evidence withheld, files sealed. The agency was making sure Garrison said that the trail stayed cold. The resistance wasn't just from Langley. When Garrison subpoenaed FBI agent Regis Kennedy, the Justice Department stepped in. Attorney General Ramsey Clark ordered Kennedy to invoke executive privilege and keep his mouth shut. The FBI man walked out of the grand jury room smiling, having said nothing. The same silence met Garrison's subpoenas aimed at CIA Director Richard Helms and others. Every door he knocked on was slammed in his face. But Garrison didn't back down. He told the press that Oswald had been a CIA asset, an employee working side by side with Jack Ruby, who murdered him in the Dallas police basement. He waved an address book linking Oswald to a Dallas businessman named Lee Odom. Odom's address was the same as Jack Ruby's unpublished 1963 phone number. To Garrison, it was proof of the CIA's hand guiding both men. These two knew each other, he said. It's no longer possible to deny it. The press split into 2 camps. Some called him reckless, accusing him of stringing together coincidences to build a circus. Columnists mocked him as a showman chasing headlines, a grandstanding DA weaving queers, misfits, and conmen into a theory so wild it made the Warren Commission look sober by comparison. Cincinnati's Post and Times-Star sneered that Garrison had paid out enough rope to hang his hair-brained theory. Others weren't so sure. Newsweek sent Hugh Ainsworth to New Orleans, who reported that Garrison's investigation was less about cracking the Kennedy case and more about shaking down the vulnerable, pressuring witnesses with charges, dangling deals, pushing them until they broke. Still, Ainsworth admitted, the idea that Oswald had CIA ties had been whispered about long before Garrison said it into microphones. Garrison leaned into the suspicion. This is not a case of one man with a gun, he said. It was a precision operation, carried out coolly with coordination. Frangible bullets, special teams, everything he told anyone who would listen, that a guerrilla-style hit squad, trained and connected to U.S. intelligence, had executed Kennedy in a crossfire, while Oswald, unwitting or not, was the perfect fall guy. The CIA denied nothing. They said nothing at all. And in that silence, Garrison found his fuel. We could solve this tomorrow, he said, if they let us. But they won't. Because if the truth comes out, it will show the CIA murdered the President of the United States. The courtroom battles, the subpoenas, the accusations, none of it slowed him. Garrison had staked everything on the claim that the government itself was shielding the killers of John F. Kennedy. To his critics, he was chasing ghosts. To his supporters, he was the only man in America willing to call the crime what it was: a conspiracy run out of Langley, protected at the highest levels of Washington. And no one, least of all the CIA, was going to help him prove it. Jim Garrison had become the most polarizing man in New Orleans. To his supporters, he was the lone crusader standing up against the federal government and exposing the real forces behind Kennedy's assassination. To his critics, he was a district attorney who had wandered into Wonderland, chasing conspiracies down rabbit holes with no exit. The newspapers had a field day. Reporters mocked his theories of Cuban exiles, homosexuals, and spies weaving an international plot to kill the president. They cast him as a hard-driving prosecutor who had traded solid evidence for French Quarter speculation. Even his accusations, bribery, coercion, and threats, were now coming back at him. The national press painted him as a prosecutor with no evidence, only noise. In February and March, Garrison threw the city into chaos when he charged Clay Shaw, a respected businessman, and David Ferry, a shadowy pilot with a history of intelligence connections. Shaw was accused of being a key figure in a plot with anti-Castro Cubans. Ferry, already infamous in the underworld, became the linchpin of Garrison's theory. But Ferry conveniently turned up dead on February 22nd. The official cause: natural causes. Garrison called it murder. The DA didn't stop. He claimed the CIA itself was paying the lawyers defending key suspects in his probe. He singled out attorneys representing Gordon Novel and others, alleging that Washington was funneling money into their defense. Naturally, they are paying, he told reporters. There's no question about that. He even dragged in names like Sandra McMains, saying her Democratic Party connections proved the fix was in. Washington pushed back. CIA spokesman called Garrison's claims baseless and irresponsible, but the DA doubled. He claimed Novel and Sergio Arcacha Smith, both anti-Castro veterans, were fugitives, hiding from his subpoenas. He demanded their return from Texas and Ohio, promising that their testimony would crack the case. The FBI and Justice Department weren't about to let him subpoena federal agents. Regis Kennedy, a veteran FBI man, was ordered not to testify. Attorney General Ramsey Clark invoked executive privilege, blocking him from speaking before the grand jury. Another FBI agent, Warren de Bruys, who had investigated Oswald back in 1963, was also protected. Garrison called it a stone wall. "This isn't going to stop our investigation," he snapped. "There's no way in the world they can stop it. All they can do is slow it down." The DA escalated. He subpoenaed Richard Helms, the CIA's director. Garrison wanted him in New Orleans to explain why the agency had photographs of Oswald at the Cuban embassy in Mexico City. He demanded Helms bring the real picture, the one Garrison swore was suppressed by the Warren Commission. Federal judges moved quickly to protect Helms, citing national security. Meanwhile, Garrison's team claimed a break. A witness, Alvin Beauboeuf, signed an affidavit saying he had been offered money to keep quiet about Ferry's activities. The DA said this was proof of federal tampering. Beauboeuf described being promised $3,000 to testify falsely, and later $30,000 if he would cooperate with what he called the conspiracy. He signed under oath, describing threats and coercion. But defense lawyers flipped it around. They said Beauboeuf was playing Garrison for money, fabricating stories to stay out of trouble. "It's Newsweek's word against his," one lawyer said. Still, the affidavit made headlines. As the legal fights dragged on, extradition battles became another obstacle. Gordon Novel fought return from Ohio. Arcacha Smith stayed one step ahead in Texas. Each time Garrison thought he had them cornered, technicalities delayed their arrival. He raged publicly, accusing the CIA and FBI of orchestrating the roadblocks. Garrison also pushed into darker territory. He accused the CIA and FBI of deliberately duping the Warren Commission, feeding investigators irrelevant information to bury the truth. The agency, he said, knew Oswald wasn't a communist at all, but a government asset working with anti-Castro groups in New Orleans. The commission, he argued, had been fed a fairy tale while the real conspiracy stayed buried. By May 1967, Garrison's investigation was a circus. National papers ridiculed him. Newsweek called his probe the most flamboyant disinformation campaign in America. Senators and federal judges dismissed him as reckless. Yet in Louisiana, men like Governor John McKeithen and Senator Russell Long kept giving him political cover. Long told reporters, "Jim's got something." Something, but what? Garrison had subpoenas, affidavits, and a grand jury. But without the cooperation of Washington, his evidence was stuck in limbo. Each week, he promised revelations. Each week, the headlines mocked him. The longer it dragged on, the more the narrative shifted. Maybe the DA wasn't exposing a cover-up at all. Maybe he was drowning in one. Still, Garrison pressed forward. "We're not going to quit," he vowed. "We're going to get them anyway." Jim Garrison wasn't buying the Warren Commission's version of history. He said their story, Oswald, the lone deranged Marxist who shot Kennedy out of nowhere, was a cover. To Garrison, Oswald wasn't a communist at all. He was something else entirely. An undercover operative, running with anti-Castro Cubans in New Orleans, carrying out assignments that made him look like a radical, but kept him tethered to U.S. intelligence. By May 1967, Garrison's campaign had taken on the shape of open war with Washington. He told reporters that the CIA and FBI had deliberately buried facts from the Warren Commission. The agencies, he said, didn't just withhold scraps. They smothered the investigation under an avalanche of irrelevant information, designed to obscure the truth. The New Orleans States item ran with the angle. Garrison was going to push for a full Senate probe of the CIA. He claimed federal agents had concealed vital knowledge about the assassination, turning themselves into accessories after the fact in one of the most brutal murders in American history. Garrison pointed directly at Lee Harvey Oswald's New Orleans period in 1963. Oswald was on the streets, handing out "Fair Play for Cuba" flyers, acting the part of a loudmouthed leftist. But Garrison's office said that was cover for his real job, an asset working with anti-communist Cuban groups while maintaining the pose of a pro-Castro agitator. The CIA denied everything. They told the Warren Commission they had no contact with Oswald, no records, no information. They said they never used him. But Garrison's investigators found evidence the agency had a photo, Oswald leaving the Cuban embassy in Mexico City with a companion. Instead of handing that over, Garrison said, the CIA supplied a fake image of a balding, middle-aged man, clearly not Oswald. It's perfectly obvious why they substituted it, Garrison told reporters, because one or both of those men were working for the United States government in the summer of 1963. In Washington, the agency stonewalled. They pointed back to their sworn statements before the Warren Commission, quoting John McCone, the CIA's director at the time. The agency never contacted him, interviewed him, talked with him, or received or solicited any report or information from him, or communicated with him in any manner. But the press kept hammering. The Hindustan Times Weekly picked up the story, running it out of New Delhi. Bid to prove Oswald was CIA operative. Even overseas, the idea was spreading that the man who killed the president may not have been a communist loner, but a pawn of American intelligence. The deeper Garrison pushed, the more federal walls went up. He subpoenaed FBI agents who worked New Orleans after the assassination, Regis Kennedy and Warren DeBruys. Both men were deeply involved in the Bureau's reports that later became Warren Commission exhibits. Kennedy brushed off questions. De Bruys wouldn't talk. Justice Department lawyers moved to block their testimony, citing long-standing FBI policy. Agents didn't testify before grand juries about material connected to their duties. Meanwhile, witnesses started falling apart under the glare. Gordon Novel, one of Garrison's key targets, turned fugitive. He told anyone who'd listened that he was CIA, that he'd been set up in a 1961 munitions burglary case Garrison tied to Ferry and Sergio Arcacha Smith. Novel called the DA a fraud and a con man, shouting his denials from Ohio while fighting extradition. His lawyer refused to confirm or deny anything, but others fell in line. Harold Weisberg, an author who tore apart the Warren report in his books, testified in front of Garrison's grand jury. He told the press straight out, Garrison's investigation is going to culminate in a congressional investigation. James Phelan, a Saturday Evening Post reporter who blasted Garrison as reckless, got slapped with a subpoena of his own. The CIA, for their part, pushed back in print. They let stories filter into the press about Oswald's supposed Soviet ties, his trip to Minsk, his Cuban contacts. One columnist even claimed Oswald had been picked as a patsy by Castro's people. A convenient counter-story, just as Garrison was gaining ground. And all the while, the fight over the photographs, the real Oswald versus the fake, hung like a shadow over the whole case. Garrison said the truth was in that hidden picture. The CIA said no such picture existed. By May of '67, the line was clear. Garrison against the most powerful intelligence agency in the world. And behind it all was the question no one in Washington wanted answered. Was Lee Harvey Oswald their man? By March 1967, the whispers in Washington weren't just whispers anymore. Drew Pearson's Washington merry-go-round laid it bare. President Johnson was sitting on what insiders called a political H-bomb. A CIA-backed plot to kill Fidel Castro, approved at the highest levels, had blown back in the worst way imaginable. The Cubans hadn't died. John Kennedy had. The column tied Robert Kennedy straight into the mess. According to Pearson's sources, Bobby had pressed the CIA to avenge the Bay of Pigs humiliation. He wanted Castro gone. But when the bullets tore through his brother in Dallas, the irony was unbearable. For weeks afterward, Bobby shut down. Friends described him as morose, unreachable, haunted by the idea that his own push for vengeance might have sparked the chain of events that ended at Dealey Plaza. Pearson quoted CIA men and insiders who called the operation the back alley struggle, a covert war of espionage, deception, and murder waged without accountability. They admitted flatly, some of the agency's best operators had suddenly and mysteriously disappeared. If the truth came out, America would learn its own government had subjected men to the most skillful, most fiendish tortures ever devised. The Warren Commission called Oswald a lone nut. But Pearson's column painted him differently. Not a communist, but a pawn, shuffled into Mexico City weeks before Dallas on agency business. The assassination, it suggested, wasn't the work of a disordered drifter. It was the byproduct of a clandestine war that had slipped its leash. December 1967, New Orleans. Jim Garrison dropped a bomb of his own. He stood before reporters and held up photographs. He said proved Kennedy hadn't been killed by Oswald's Italian carbine. The fatal shot, Garrison claimed, came from a .45 caliber pistol. The photos showed a man stooping to pick up a bullet at Dealey Plaza. Enlarged, it was clear enough for ballistics men to say, .45, full metal jacket. Not a Mannlicher Carcano round. Not even close. Garrison said the bullet was clutched in the man's hand, hidden in plain sight. If this is true, Garrison told the press, it means the assassination was staged by a team of professionals, protected by elements of the federal government itself. He called it a camouflage operation. Smoke and mirrors to shield the real killers, while Oswald took the fall. Johnson knew it, Garrison insisted. The president himself necessarily must know the Warren Commission's conclusion is a fraud, and that the people of the United States have been lied to. The evidence, if believed, shattered the case against Oswald. A .45 caliber handgun couldn't have been fired from the book depository. It meant a second gunman was present, possibly standing feet from Kennedy when the fatal shot was delivered. By July 1968, Garrison pushed further. He told reporters he had proof of foreign intelligence involvement. Not Cuba, not Russia, Europe. Garrison wouldn't name the country outright, but said its intelligence service had unearthed names, Dallas police with links to the plot, and details of David Ferry's trips to Texas for pre-assassination meetings. He described an unnamed intermediary who brought him the information, backed by top men from that country's intelligence community. According to Garrison, the conspiracy wasn't just a New Orleans cabal. It was an international operation, backed by extremely powerful industrial interests in the American Southwest and serviced by U.S. intelligence cutouts. The CIA, he claimed, didn't just cover up the killing. They had worked the mechanics, training the shooters, staging the cover stories, laundering the evidence. With Ferry dead and Oswald silenced, Garrison zeroed in on Clay Shaw. In March 1967, he arrested the 55-year-old businessman, accusing him of conspiring with Ferry, Oswald, and Jack Ruby to kill the president. Shaw denied everything. He was a retired executive, a pillar of New Orleans society, chain-smoking and sharp in a courtroom suit. But Garrison said Shaw was more than that. He was an agency asset, running covert operations behind the cover of the International Trade Mart. The Supreme Court gave Garrison the green light to prosecute, rejecting Shaw's claim that the Warren report should be binding law. Judge Edward Haggerty called in 169 jurors to start the trial in early 1969. Garrison's line was simple. Kennedy didn't die at the hands of a lone assassin. He was murdered by a network, and Shaw was part of it. By summer 1968, Garrison claimed he wasn't working alone. He had opened a back channel with a foreign intelligence agency. Over the phone, he told reporters his liaison was with a military ally of the United States, and that the agency had even interviewed one of the assassins. The operation, Garrison said, had been serviced by CIA cutouts, men who trained Oswald in Japan, then ran him as a false defector into Russia, finally positioning him in Dallas. 4 assassination teams, Garrison claimed, had been deployed. 2 gunmen on the grassy knoll, one on the 6th floor of the book depository, another at street level. Even inside Washington, Garrison found allies. He brought in William R. Wood, a former CIA instructor in clandestine operations, as his own intelligence advisor. Wood, who had spent years in agency fieldwork, backed Garrison's theory that the assassination was no fluke. It was an orchestrated mission. December 1967. Edgar Eugene Bradley, a California preacher tied to far-right radio evangelist Carl McIntyre, surrendered to Los Angeles authorities after Garrison accused him of conspiracy. Bradley denied everything. He told the judge, "I know I'm not guilty of any crime." God knows I'm not guilty. That's the important thing. California's governor, Ronald Reagan, held the key. Extradite Bradley to Louisiana, or let him walk. While the fight played out, Bradley was released without bail. His lawyer vowed to fight extradition tooth and nail. Bradley's defense framed him as a victim of mistaken identity, even communist framing. McIntyre himself went on national radio, defending Bradley as a Christian gentleman caught in political crossfire. To Garrison, Bradley was one more piece of the puzzle, another operative in the vast machinery that put Kennedy in the ground. By the end of 1967, the counterattack was in motion. Leaked military records appeared in the press, painting Garrison as mentally unfit, a man discharged from the army with a diagnosis of severe and disabling psychoneurosis. The Pentagon confirmed the documents had been released improperly. An internal probe began immediately, but the damage was done. The timing was surgical. The leaks came just days after Garrison subpoenaed 3 new witnesses tied to the assassination. It was the same pattern, again and again. Each time Garrison pressed forward, new discrediting stories surfaced. Medical files, background smears, ridicule in the national press. The message was clear. Dig too deep into Dallas, and the machine would bury you alive. By March 1967, the whispers in Washington weren't just whispers anymore. Drew Pearson's Washington merry-go-round laid it bare. President Johnson was sitting on what insiders called a political H-bomb. A CIA-backed plot to kill Fidel Castro, approved at the highest levels, had blown back in the worst way imaginable. The Cubans hadn't died. John Kennedy had. The column tied Robert Kennedy straight into the mess. According to Pearson's sources, Bobby had pressed the CIA to avenge the Bay of Pigs humiliation. He wanted Castro gone. But when the bullets tore through his brother in Dallas, the irony was unbearable. For weeks afterward, Bobby shut down. Friends described him as morose, unreachable, haunted by the idea that his own push for vengeance might have sparked the chain of events that ended at Dealey Plaza. Pearson quoted CIA men and insiders who called the operation the back alley struggle, a covert war of espionage, deception, and murder, waged without accountability. They admitted flatly some of the agency's best operators had suddenly and mysteriously disappeared. If the truth came out, America would learn its own government had subjected men to the most skillful, most fiendish tortures ever devised. The Warren Commission called Oswald a lone nut. But Pearson's column painted him differently. Not a communist, but a pawn, shuffled into Mexico City weeks before Dallas, on agency business. The assassination, it suggested, wasn't the work of a disordered drifter. It was the byproduct of a clandestine war that had slipped its leash. December 1967, New Orleans. Jim Garrison dropped a bomb of his own. He stood before reporters and held up photographs he said proved Kennedy hadn't been killed by Oswald's Italian carbine. The fatal shot, Garrison claimed, came from a .45 caliber pistol. The photos showed a man stooping to pick up a bullet at Dealey Plaza. Enlarged, it was clear enough for ballistics men to say .45, full metal jacket. Not a Mannlicher Carcano round. Not even close. Garrison said the bullet was clutched in the man's hand, hidden in plain sight. If this is true, Garrison told the press, it means the assassination was staged by a team of professionals, protected by elements of the federal government itself. He called it a camouflage operation, smoke and mirrors to shield the real killers while Oswald took the fall. Johnson knew it, Garrison insisted. The president himself necessarily must know the Warren Commission's conclusion is a fraud, and that the people of the United States have been lied to. The evidence, if believed, shattered the case against Oswald. A .45 caliber handgun couldn't have been fired from the book depository. It meant a second gunman was present, possibly standing feet from Kennedy when the fatal shot was delivered. By July 1968, Garrison pushed further. He told reporters he had proof of foreign intelligence involvement. Not Cuba, not Russia, Europe. Garrison wouldn't name the country outright, but said its intelligence service had unearthed names. Dallas police with links to the plot, and details of David Ferry's trips to Texas for pre-assassination meetings. He described an unnamed intermediary who brought him the information, backed by top men from that country's intelligence community. According to Garrison, the conspiracy wasn't just a New Orleans cabal. It was an international operation, backed by extremely powerful industrial interests in the American Southwest and serviced by U.S. intelligence cutouts. The CIA, he claimed, didn't just cover up the killing. They had worked the mechanics, training the shooters, staging the cover stories, laundering the evidence. With Ferry dead and Oswald silenced, Garrison zeroed in on Clay Shaw. In March 1967, he arrested the 55-year-old businessman, accusing him of conspiring with Ferry, Oswald, and Jack Ruby to kill the president. Shaw denied everything. He was a retired executive, a pillar of New Orleans society, chain-smoking and sharp in a courtroom suit. But Garrison said Shaw was more than that. He was an agency asset, running covert operations behind the cover of the International Trade Mart. The Supreme Court gave Garrison the green light to prosecute, rejecting Shaw's claim that the Warren Report should be binding law. Judge Edward Haggerty called in 169 jurors to start the trial in early 1969. Garrison's line was simple. Kennedy didn't die at the hands of a lone assassin. He was murdered by a network, and Shaw was part of it. By summer 1968, Garrison claimed he wasn't working alone. He had opened a back channel with a foreign intelligence agency. Over the phone, he told reporters his liaison was with a military ally of the United States, and that the agency had even interviewed one of the assassins. The operation, Garrison said, had been serviced by CIA cutouts, men who trained Oswald in Japan, then ran him as a false defector into Russia, finally positioning him in Dallas. 4 assassination teams, Garrison claimed, had been deployed. 2 gunmen on the grassy knoll, one on the 6th floor of the book depository, another at street level. Even inside Washington, Garrison found allies. He brought in William R. Wood, a former CIA instructor in clandestine operations, as his own intelligence advisor. Wood, who had spent years in agency fieldwork, backed Garrison's theory that the assassination was no fluke. It was an orchestrated mission. December 1967. Edgar Eugene Bradley, a California preacher tied to far-right radio evangelist Carl McIntyre, surrendered to Los Angeles authorities after Garrison accused him of conspiracy. Bradley denied everything. He told the judge, "I know I'm not guilty of any crime. God knows I'm not guilty. That's the important thing." California's governor, Ronald Reagan, held the key. Extradite Bradley to Louisiana, or let him walk. While the fight played out, Bradley was released without bail. His lawyer vowed to fight extradition tooth and nail. Bradley's defense framed him as a victim of mistaken identity, even communist framing. McIntyre himself went on national radio, defending Bradley as a Christian gentleman caught in political crossfire. To Garrison, Bradley was one more piece of the puzzle, another operative in the vast machinery that put Kennedy in the ground. By the end of 1967, the counterattack was in motion. Leaked military records appeared in the press, painting Garrison as mentally unfit. A man discharged from the army with a diagnosis of severe and disabling psychoneurosis. The Pentagon confirmed the documents had been released improperly. An internal probe began immediately, but the damage was done. The timing was surgical. The leaks came just days after Garrison subpoenaed 3 new witnesses tied to the assassination. It was the same pattern, again and again. Each time Garrison pressed forward, new discrediting stories surfaced. Medical files, background smears, ridicule in the national press. The message was clear. Dig too deep into Dallas, and the machine would bury you alive. On February 22, 1968, in The Hague, Dutch journalist Willem Oltmans sat across from Jim Garrison, who was still carrying the weight of New Orleans' most explosive investigation. Cameras rolled, but Garrison spoke as though he were in a back room of a police precinct, laying it all out with no polish, no filter. President Kennedy was killed by elements of the Central Intelligence Agency, Garrison began. No hesitation, no qualifiers. He admitted it sounded strong, maybe even reckless, but it was the truth as he saw it. For years, he said, the agency had perfected the art of assassination, building elaborate covers and backstories to cloak their work. "It's an executive action," he explained. "That takes the sin out of it. Just a job properly done." He compared it to Germany under Hitler. "What we're talking about is fascism that's arrived in America." To Garrison, the Constitution was already a relic, outflanked by an intelligence agency that was more powerful than any elected branch of government. Altmans pressed him. What did he mean, fascism? Garrison shot back that it wasn't jackboots or concentration camps. It was napalm. It was a government willing to use weapons of mass destruction against civilians, justifying it as defense against communism. When the government doesn't care what it's doing to other human beings because it has the power to do it, he said, you have fascism. The CIA, he argued, wasn't going to tolerate the truth of Kennedy's murder being dragged into daylight. He believed the same power that killed Kennedy would kill anyone who got too close. Still, Garrison insisted his office couldn't back down. They had stumbled on David Ferry almost by accident, just combing through odd characters in New Orleans who might connect to Oswald. Ferrie, a pilot, with maps of Cuba in his house and ties to the agency, stood out. They tailed him, staked out his home, even found evidence that suggested Ferry's library card had been used by Oswald. The FBI shrugged it off. The Secret Service asked a few questions, but nothing stuck. Then Ferry turned up dead under circumstances Garrison never bought. Pressed by Altmans, Garrison said it was impossible that President Johnson didn't know. The Warren Commission was stacked with men who had deep CIA ties: Allen Dulles, Richard Russell, John McCloy. They knew the CIA killed Kennedy, Garrison said. The president had to know. Everyone at that level had to know. As he spoke, Garrison began piecing the trail that led from Dallas back to New Orleans. Ferry's strange trips, traffic patterns through Houston, connections with midnight flights to Fort Worth, and finally, CIA operations tied to Cuba. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered. One name after another traced back to the agency, sometimes as outright employees, sometimes as former agents still doing the work. Ferry himself had trained pilots in Guatemala before the Bay of Pigs. Afterward, he was assigned as a pilot in plots to kill Castro. Lee Harvey Oswald was one of theirs too, Garrison said flatly. He was set up before he ever came back from Russia. He was the perfect decoy. Then came the hammer. Garrison claimed they had evidenced the FBI knew about the assassination attempt days in advance. On November 17, 1963, a bureau telegram went to all Southern regional offices warning that an attempt would be made on the president's life in Dallas. But when the day came, Kennedy still rode through Dealey Plaza, head exposed. They guaranteed he'd be dead before reaching the hospital, Garrison said. The CIA, he argued, had become a government within the government. Too powerful, too entrenched. Congress didn't control it. The president didn't control it. What we have, Garrison told Altmans, is a self-sustaining juggernaut. If you try to pull it off orbit, you're going to have your head torn off. Kennedy had crossed that line. He was moving toward peace, toward détente with the Soviets, toward recognition of Cuba, toward pulling troops out of Vietnam. The CIA, Garrison said, saw it as betrayal. The Cold War had built the agency's empire. Peace would dismantle it. So, they staged an overkill operation in Dallas. Shots from the Texas School Book Depository. Shots from the grassy knoll. Shots from the picket fence. They weren't leaving anything to chance, Garrison said. And then there was the Zapruder film. Garrison had seen it in New York, studied it over and over. To him, it was the smoking gun. You don't have to be a genius, he told Altmans. Kennedy was shot from the front. The back of his head blows out. Any American can see it. which makes the Warren Commission's conclusion an absolute fraud. By the end of the interview, Garrison's voice hardened. He wasn't just talking about Dallas anymore. He was talking about the United States itself. "Fascism has arrived here," he said, "and John Kennedy was killed because he tried to stop it." By 1968, Jim Garrison wasn't just fighting in courtrooms. He was pulling on the strings of the most powerful men in America. The deeper he dug into the Kennedy assassination, the more he saw the outlines of an operation he believed was tied directly to the CIA. And he wasn't about to let the agency, or its friends, off the hook. The subpoena was the weapon. On February 15th, Garrison issued one to Allen Dulles, the former CIA director and a sitting member of the Warren Commission. Dulles had been one of the architects of the agency, the man who had overseen coups, invasions, and black ops around the world. Now he was being ordered to testify about Kennedy's murder. Inside CIA channels, the order didn't go unnoticed. Mr. Houston, an agency lawyer, phoned Dulles, telling him to sit tight, accept the papers if served, and not panic. Another agency contact, Mr. Lansdale, was on standby with instructions to handle matters while Dulles took the weekend off. The CIA was already coordinating its response before the subpoena had even touched Dulles's hands. But Garrison wasn't done. That same day, he also subpoenaed Gordon Novell, a 29-year-old former New Orleans nightclub operator who'd fled to Ohio to avoid him. Novell had once admitted to working with David Ferry, the ex-airline pilot tied to the CIA's Bay of Pigs invasion. Ferry was dead now, found in his apartment under suspicious circumstances, just days after Garrison's probe became public. But Novell was alive, and Garrison wanted him under oath. Novell's story wasn't small time. He had described Ferry as a CIA operative, a man who trained pilots in Guatemala before the Bay of Pigs, and later became part of anti-Castro plots. Ferry wasn't just a fringe player. He was central to the shadow network that connected Cuban exiles, New Orleans operatives, and elements of U.S. intelligence. Garrison had offered Novell immunity from prosecution if he'd testify, but Novell bolted anyway. Now, with the subpoena, Ohio courts were being asked to send him back to New Orleans. In his statement, Garrison didn't mince words. He said his office had succeeded in identifying the Kennedy assassination as an operation conducted by elements of the CIA. He tied Ferry directly to that operation. Ferry, he argued, wasn't acting alone. He was part of a crew that had been training, traveling, and running operations for years. Every move Garrison made was a direct challenge to Washington. He wasn't circling low-level suspects anymore. He was subpoenaing Dulles, the man who had run the CIA during the Bay of Pigs, and who had sat on the very commission that ruled Kennedy's murder, the work of a lone gunman. The agency, meanwhile, was watching, preparing, and calculating. Inside Langley, the subpoenas weren't just paperwork. They were cracks in the wall Garrison was trying to smash through. This was no longer about whether Oswald acted alone. It was about whether America's own intelligence service had orchestrated the killing of a sitting president, and Garrison, stubborn and fearless, was dragging their ghosts into the light. In early '67, a memo landed on the desk of W.C. Sullivan at FBI headquarters. It carried a simple but explosive synopsis. District Attorney Jim Garrison claimed David Ferry had ties to a group of anti-Castro Cubans training outside New Orleans back in '61 and '62. The site was Camp Beauregard at Lake Pontchartrain. The Cubans were allegedly being prepped for covert operations by the CIA. On February 23, 1961, CIA officers quietly told the Bureau that yes, such a project existed. One phase involved training Cuban exiles at Camp Bellechasse, just south of New Orleans. A deactivated Navy base would reopen for the job. The plan was to run 15 to 40 Cubans through at a time over 5 weeks. Officially, the FBI said they never investigated CIA activities at Bellechasse. Unofficially, the Bureau knew what was going on but kept their hands off. Nothing in Bureau files tied Ferry or Oswald directly to the camp, at least not on paper. By July 1963, more whispers reached the FBI. Cuban refugees were trickling into New Orleans from Miami. A man named Rudolph Davis acted as coordinator, lining up jobs in the Guatemalan lumber camps. The cover story was that the Cubans would cut wood. The reality, according to sources, was that the men expected military training. Instead, they were used for labor, got disillusioned, and drifted back to Miami. No documented connection linked Oswald or Ferry to Davis's group, but Garrison believed the overlap was more than coincidence. Then came January '67. Raymond Beck, once an FBI agent, now working locally in Orleans Parish, reported back. Garrison had subpoenaed Ferry before his sudden death, and the DA's office was questioning witnesses in front of the parish grand jury. Beck said he wasn't sure what Garrison's game was, but he'd heard the DA was determined to blow holes in the Warren report. Another voice, Pershing Gervais, a former investigator with the parish, told the FBI flat out, Garrison was obsessed. He warned him to drop it and said he'd never help. He admitted Ferry had tried to pull him in, but he refused. He figured Garrison was chasing ghosts. Meanwhile, Leon Ivan, a New Orleans cop turned DA's investigator, went digging into the late Guy Bannister's old network. Ex-FBI man, private detective, right-wing extremist. Ivan wanted names of Bannister's Cuban associates, pictures, anything connecting them to Oswald. Informants hinted Bannister's crew had been running operations tied to Cuba, even shipping vehicles south. Jack Martin and Joseph Newborough, both associates of Bannister, were questioned. One report even mentioned a Cuban exile woman, Sylvia Odio, whose story of meeting Oswald and Cuban conspirators circulated in the Warren Report's files. By May, FBI field offices were reporting constant chatter out of New Orleans. Garrison and his men were making statements on radio and TV, and the Bureau noted the possibility of leaks or wild claims spreading far beyond Louisiana. Then came April, and Dean Andrews, a local lawyer, told the Bureau that Garrison was pressing him to confirm Clay Shaw was Clay Bertrand, and to link a Latin-looking man with Ferry and Oswald. Around the same time, a jailhouse snitch named Vernon Bundy told another inmate he'd been offered a deal by Garrison, testify that he saw Clay Shaw pass money to Oswald and he'd catch a break on his sentence. Bundy eventually testified in open court, though privately admitted the story wasn't true. On July 5, 1967, another memo landed on Sullivan's desk. It detailed Perry Russo's testimony, the young insurance salesman who claimed he sat in Ferry's apartment while Ferry, Shaw, and Oswald discussed assassinating Kennedy. Russo became the linchpin of Garrison's case. But FBI informants painted a darker picture. Russo, they said, had a history of psychiatric treatment, drug use, and unstable behavior. During a polygraph exam, his breathing was so erratic he was deemed unfit for testing. Russo told conflicting stories. At times he admitted he didn't even know if Shaw was present at the meeting he described. At others, he swore he was ready to testify in court. The same memo included Sandra McMains, a young woman once tied to Russo. She'd been tracked down in Omaha and pressed to testify. She refused, even after promises of luxury accommodations and new clothes. A polygraph exam found her substantially truthful when she denied attending meetings with Shaw, Oswald, or Ferry. The FBI's observation section summed it up. Russo was unreliable, McMains refused to play ball, and Garrison's case was leaning on shaky ground. Still, Garrison pressed forward. He believed the conspiracy ran through Ferry, Shaw, Bannister, and the Cuban exile network that had swirled around New Orleans in the early 60s. The Bureau, meanwhile, kept its distance. Their reports noted Garrison's claims, logged the statements, and quietly filed them away. To them, it looked like Garrison was building a house of cards. But inside those memos lay the same names, same connections, and same shadows that had haunted New Orleans since November 22nd, 1963. By 1962, Lily May had had enough. Raised in Lucedale, Mississippi, by relatives who never really felt like her own, she bolted. She drifted through Mobile, San Bernardino, Omaha, Des Moines, then back to New Orleans. She wasn't chasing a dream. She was chasing survival. On Bourbon Street, she gave herself a new name, Sandra Moffett. That's when she crossed paths with Perry Russo. He was walking with Ken, Lefty Peterson, and a guy called Timmy. Russo played the charmer, offered her rides, asked her to school. Soon, she was pulled into his orbit. Parties at places like the Frenchman's Inn, late nights, cheap coffee, and gasoline stops. By early 1963, she was pregnant. Russo told her to disappear until the baby was born. Then, he said, maybe they'd talk. When she pressed him, things turned ugly. She claimed a man she didn't know put Russo under hypnosis, made him admit he was the father. Later, Russo denied everything. Their relationship spiraled. His friend Fido roughed her up in a front yard, fists in her stomach, telling her to leave Perry alone. At 3 months pregnant, she swallowed 175 aspirin in a suicide attempt. A girl named Kathy dragged her to Charity Hospital. She lived. The baby, born prematurely on August 30th, 1963, survived too. Her world got darker. She said Russo photographed her having sex with other men, kept the prints locked away. She drifted into prostitution, hustling to scrape money together to buy her child back from her mother. Perry borrowed cash off her, never paid it back. She said he wanted to photograph her, and a girl named Kathy mid-act, but it never happened. After the birth, she took up with James Robert Irvin. They left New Orleans for Alabama, then San Bernardino. By 64, she married him in Tijuana. He walked out a week later. She came back to New Orleans and inevitably back to Russo. That's when Dave Ferry entered the picture. Perry introduced them in early '66. She described Ferry's blue Ford station wagon, his roommates, his small apartment. She went there several times. Sometimes it was for lunch, other times to hit bars and dance. She swore she never saw Clay Shaw or Lee Harvey Oswald at Ferry's place, never heard plotting about killing a president. Russo, she said, was obsessed with politics, a Goldwater Republican who scribbled notes about everything. Her testimony was a problem for Jim Garrison. His star witness, Russo, had put himself at a party where Oswald, Ferry, and Shaw supposedly plotted the assassination. Lily May, who knew Russo intimately, denied it ever happened. She told federal agents that the only political gathering she attended with Perry was a forgettable Canal Street meeting in '65. She didn't hear Spanish, didn't see Cubans, didn't catch Oswald's name. She painted Russo as a schemer. She recalled finding his friend Mike Fitzgerald in a bathroom, wrists slashed, a suicide attempt. She claimed Russo wanted her to pose in staged sex photographs with Irvin, to hustle insurance money, to do whatever fed his compulsions. When 2 of Garrison's investigators showed up at her Omaha home in March 1967, they told her to pack a bag. She refused. They promised her fine hotels and clothes if she'd just come back to New Orleans. Her husband, Harold McMains, said no. He wanted a lawyer. They told him to forget it, keep quiet, or someone might get hurt. She didn't leave. Instead, she told her story to a reporter, Zimmerman, at the World Herald. The story cost her and her husband their jobs, but it also forced Garrison's hand. In June 1967, she sat for a polygraph in Des Moines. They grilled her. Did you ever meet Shaw? Did you ever go to Ferry's house for a party? Did Perry tell you the president was going to be assassinated? Every answer was no. The machine backed her up. Her last word on Perry Russo was blunt. In July 1965, he asked her to marry him. She refused. He told her if she didn't, he'd find someone else who would. Anything to keep out of the military. To her, it was clear. Russo wasn't testifying out of conscience. He was testifying to stay free. The examiner's conclusion was final. Lily May told the truth. By 1962, Lily May McMains had run as far as she could. She bolted from home and landed in New Orleans, chasing after her sister Gertrude. She said she just had to know if her sister was as bad as everyone claimed. That search turned into a 6-hour interrogation years later, where Lily mapped out her movements like a fugitive's itinerary: Mobile, San Bernardino, Omaha, Des Moines, circling back again and again to New Orleans. She told investigators she used the alias Sandra Moffett the first time she hit New Orleans. 3 weeks into her stay, her sister finally let her go on the town alone. That night, she crossed Bourbon Street and ran headlong into Perry Russo. Russo wasn't alone. He was with Ken, a guy named Lefty Peterson, and another they called Timmy. They all piled into Russo's car, drove around for gas and coffee, and talked about school, parties, and women. Russo asked if she'd skip class to hang with him the next morning. She said she'd only go if her sister allowed it. The next day, Russo showed up again. Her sister blocked her from going with him, but later relented, allowing Lily to attend a party for Ken Wink. The party was at the Frenchman's Inn. Perry was late picking her up, caught in a storm, but by 9 o'clock they were there. Lily said she and Perry kept dating until early '63. That's when she told him she was pregnant. His answer was cold. Get lost. Look me up after the baby's born. When she pressed him again, he cracked. Perry confessed during a trance. A stranger, a hypnotist around 50 years old, put him under in front of Lily. In that state, Perry admitted he was the father. When he came out, he denied everything. Later, Lily said, the same hypnotist put Perry under again at a joint called the Royal Castle, giving him suggestions like a stage act. When I snap my fingers, you'll awaken. Get off the stool, walk to the door, then return and freeze in your tracks. Perry performed like a puppet. But Lily wasn't fooled. She thought he was faking. The next time she went to see him, things turned ugly. Perry's friend, a guy called Fido, knocked her to the ground, punched her in the stomach and screamed, "Why don't you leave him alone?" She yelled for Perry, but he never came outside. Fido went in instead, leaving her beaten on the lawn. She staggered home. By 3 months pregnant, she swallowed 175 aspirin in a suicide attempt. A friend, Kathy, found her and dragged her to Charity Hospital. Doctors pumped her stomach and called the police, but Kathy convinced them not to book her. When she was 4 months along, she married a man in Dallas named Frank Adams. She didn't explain the divorce. Back in her mid-teens, she'd already been in and out of psychiatrists' offices after running away from home. Her mother dragging her in, but never telling her why. The baby came early, August 30th, 1963. She was discharged from the hospital a few days later. Russo surfaced again, photographing her in sex acts with other men. He had his own darkroom, developed the film himself. Friends visited her in the hospital. Anne came. Her parents travelled from Alabama. But when the baby was released September 20th, Lily left New Orleans with James Robert Irvin, a man Russo had introduced her to. They headed for 8 Mile, Alabama. Jimmy, as she called him, couldn't keep a job in Mobile, so he returned to New Orleans, working at the Little Crystal Cafe on Royal Street. He stayed weekdays, hitchhiked back to Alabama weekends. In February 1964, Lily and Jimmy left 8 Mile for San Bernardino, California. She left the baby with her mother in Alabama. That summer, she and Jimmy married in Tijuana. By June, Jimmy walked out. She drifted back to New Orleans by bus. Russo was there waiting at the depot. He brought her to his apartment. The next day she rented her own place, started working, and ran into Jimmy again. They tried living together, but it fell apart in a week. He was gone for good by July 3rd, 1964. Broke and desperate, Lily slid into prostitution to earn enough to reclaim her baby. Russo, meanwhile, kept bleeding her. Around $100 here, 20 there. Insurance money, he said. She never saw it again. In early 1965, Russo took her to meet Dave Ferry. They stopped briefly at his apartment, met his two roommates, then left. A week later, Dave invited her back for lunch. He picked her up in a blue Ford station wagon. She stayed until late afternoon. Soon after, she saw him again at Sam's place where she worked. He asked her out for Friday. That night he collected her, took her to his place where his roommates waited, then out dancing and drinking. Lily swore she never met Shaw or Oswald. She never went to Ferry's for a party. She went to football games, basketball and baseball with Russo and Lefty Peterson, but denied any connection to the assassination plot. Russo, she said, was obsessed with politics. A Republican, a Goldwater backer, always talking. In 1965, she went with him to a meeting at a Canal Street house. 3 men she didn't know. Spanish wasn't spoken. No Cubans, no Puerto Ricans. Just a TV in the back room and quiet conversations. She remembered Russo's quirks. He wrote everything down, errands, reminders, so much that he claimed he'd forget without it. She once found his friend Mike Fitzgerald slashed up in Perry's bathroom after a suicide attempt. Another time, Russo suggested photographing her and Jimmy Irvin during sex. A friend named Jeannie flipped out on him for even raising it. Her work as a prostitute brought more ugly stories. One night, she locked a John in the bathroom, stole $120, and bolted. Another time, Russo wanted to film her and a friend named Kathy together, but the act never happened. In March 1967, men from District Attorney Garrison's office, Sims and Jonah, showed up in Omaha where she was living. They wanted her back in New Orleans for photographs. She refused. They told her not to worry. They'd buy her clothes, set her up in hotels, feed her well. Her husband, Harold McMains, stepped in, demanding a lawyer. The men warned him off, quiet down, or she'd get hurt. Lily told her story to a reporter named Zimmerman at the World Herald in Omaha. It cost both her and Harold their jobs. Zimmerman linked her to attorney Lex Hawkins. She was wired up for polygraphs, 4 tests. Every time she denied attending any party at Ferry's house, or meeting Shaw or Oswald. Every time the charts read clean. When asked why Russo was pushing this story, she said it was desperation. He wanted her to marry him in '65 to keep him out of the draft. If you won't marry me, I'll find someone else who will. The Examiner closed his file with a single line. Lily May McMains substantially told the truth. June 22nd, 1967. L.H. Harrelson got a call out of New Orleans that changed the temperature of Jim Garrison's case. The source was solid, well-known, trained at the Keeler Polygraph Institute, and tied into law enforcement circles. He said Perry Russo had just been examined by a polygraph expert in the sheriff's office. The verdict? Russo was lying about the story that had made him famous, the alleged plot to kill President John F. Kennedy. The informant went further. Russo, he said, had already been put through the ringer. Narco-interrogation with sodium pentothal, hypnosis sessions. A local psychiatrist had blasted Garrison for even using these tactics. If Russo was going to be tested, the source insisted, it had to be on a straight polygraph, not some carnival sideshow. The first meeting with Russo came on June 16, 1967. Russo wanted a trial run on the polygraph, 10 or 20 questions, just to see if the examiner could spot a lie. The examiner humored him, asked Russo to write a number on a piece of paper and tuck it in his pocket. They made a $5 bet. The machine nailed it. Russo called the bet. He lost. 3 days later, Russo was back in the office, officially under examination. The polygraphist didn't like what he saw. Russo's breathing was erratic, his pneumograph tracings wild enough that the examiner told Garrison flat out, Russo was an unfit subject. When pressed, Russo admitted something else, that he didn't even know if Clay Shaw had been at the supposed meeting. If he had to give a yes or no, he'd say no. But in court, under oath, Russo had testified Shaw was there. When asked why, he told the examiner he went in planning to say he wasn't sure. Then Shaw's attorney asked if he believed in God. The question got under his skin, and he swore Shaw was present. The informant dug deeper. Russo admitted he'd been in psychiatric treatment for a year and a half. He admitted homosexual encounters. And the examiner, based on years of experience, said what the tracings showed wasn't nerves, it was deception. Garrison didn't want to hear it. The examiner was told to keep his mouth shut. His written report would say only that Russo was an unfit subject. Nothing more. But privately, the judgment was harsher. Perry Russo was lying. Meanwhile, the Bureau was running its own checks on Garrison's operation. On May 30th, 1967, an FBI review noted the possibility that Garrison's people, maybe Garrison himself, had been freelancing their version of the case to the press, to TV, to anyone who'd listen. The background noise kept building. Dean Andrews told the FBI that Garrison had leaned on him to identify Clay Shaw as Clay Bertrand, and to pick out a Latin-looking man in a photo next to David Ferry and Oswald. Another source, prisoner Vernon Bundy, admitted privately that Garrison's office had dangled a deal if he'd say he saw Shaw pass money on the lakefront. Bundy wasn't sure what to do, except that he'd do anything to get out of his sentence. He hinted that the story he'd told under oath wasn't real. It had been handed to him. Then came Jack S. Martin, an old hustler who'd drifted through the case before, adding his own noise to the signal. He told the Bureau that Bundy had flat out admitted the same thing. His testimony against Shaw was manufactured. On top of that, a federal memo dated February 27, 1967, recorded another informant's warning. Dave Ferry had been a pill-popping fantasist, a man who loved to talk wild schemes but never made a serious move. If anyone knew Ferry's real activities in 1963, it was a character named Morris Brownlee, a homosexual, a junkie, a man who'd once worked for G. Ray Gill, Shaw's defense lawyer. Brownlee had been arrested in 1964 at the Quorum Club on Esplanade. His background tied him to dope and desperation, not a presidential murder plot. The more the Bureau pulled Garrison's case, the looser the threads became. Witnesses swayed. Testimonies contradicted each other. Informants pointed fingers at Garrison's team itself, accusing them of coaching, pressuring, even bribing prisoners for the story they wanted told. And through it all, Perry Russo, the star witness, looked more and more like a man cracking under the weight of lies. By the summer of 1967, Jim Garrison's investigation into the Kennedy assassination had expanded beyond New Orleans street-level players like Perry Russo and David Ferry. His focus shifted higher, toward Langley. The district attorney was now openly claiming the Central Intelligence Agency had fingerprints all over Dallas. According to internal memoranda circulating in Washington, Garrison believed Lee Harvey Oswald didn't act alone, if he acted at all. He told reporters Oswald was a CIA operative who had been working undercover with anti-Castro Cubans. The mission, Garrison said, had originally been sanctioned, a plot to kill Fidel Castro. But when the mission imploded, Oswald became the patsy, and Kennedy the casualty. In a June 2, 1967 memo, the Justice Department noted Garrison's specific allegations. 5 anti-Castro Cubans, angry over Kennedy's handling of the Bay of Pigs, carried out the hit. They were ex-CIA employees, trained for covert work in Cuba. Garrison admitted he didn't think Langley itself had ordered Kennedy's murder, but he accused the agency of working overtime to keep his office off the trail, stonewalling, cutting off leads, burying evidence. Garrison told anyone who would listen that he had letters signed by CIA representatives and even Senator Robert Kennedy authorizing Americans to work with Cubans on Castro assassination attempts. The CIA flatly denied those letters ever existed. He also pushed a theory that Oswald had trained at a CIA-sponsored camp near Lake Pontchartrain. This camp, supposedly run by a hustler named Richard Davis, was said to be a staging ground for Cuban exile operations. The Bureau scoured its files. Nothing on Davis, no camp, no records, nothing. Still, Garrison hammered away. He told the press Oswald was probably recruited by CIA for an operation approved by the president himself. When Oswald failed, the cover story became Kennedy's death. The DA even accused the agency of slipping the Warren Commission a fake photograph of Oswald and a Cuban companion leaving the Cuban embassy in Mexico City. CIA officials swore under oath they had no such photo. The deeper Garrison dug, the more tangled his net became. He charged Gordon Novel, a hustler with intelligence pretensions, with burglarizing a Schlumberger munitions bunker in 1961. Garrison claimed Novel had stolen ammunition and explosives later tied to the assassination plot. Novel countered that he had been working for CIA at the time, that the whole thing was part of an authorized operation. The CIA denied ever hearing of him, dismissing Novel as a con man spinning stories to save himself. Then came Sergio Arcacha Smith, a Cuban exile Garrison accused of helping in the same munitions burglary. CIA files showed Smith had been a liaison for anti-Castro activities, connected to the Frente Revolucionario Democrático, a Miami-based exile front group. Langley admitted providing financial support to the FRD, but denied any direct operational ties to Smith himself. By late May 1967, the paper trail was thick. Garrison delivered a letter from Gordon Novel to the FBI, addressed to a mysterious Mr. Weiss, attempting to connect a CIA-linked company called Double Check Corporation to the assassination. The CIA admitted Double Check had been used as a front for recruiting pilots during the Bay of Pigs operation, but denied any link to Kennedy's murder or to Novel. And then there was Clay Shaw. To Garrison, the New Orleans businessman wasn't just a local power broker. He was a CIA asset involved in anti-Castro operations. Garrison said Shaw's role in the conspiracy was either to direct the plot or cover it when it collapsed. CIA records acknowledged Shaw had once been in contact with them through domestic services, but insisted it was limited to national contacts. The last official record, they claimed, was in May 1956. Behind closed doors, Washington treated Garrison's charges like a wildfire. Contain it, deny everything, but don't feed it oxygen. Justice Department files described him as convinced of a CIA conspiracy, but the Bureau's notes were blunt. No evidence supported his claims. What emerged from this chapter wasn't proof of conspiracy, but something almost as corrosive: the unmistakable stench of overlap. Anti-Castro Cubans trained, armed, and funded by the CIA exiles, angry enough at Kennedy to welcome bloodshed. Local hustlers who claimed agency ties, and Clay Shaw, a respected figure in New Orleans, now painted as a spook by his own district attorney. For Garrison, which was enough. In his eyes, the CIA hadn't just touched the edges of the Kennedy assassination. They were in the room. Whether Washington admitted it or not, the DA believed the agency's shadow ran straight through Dallas. July 25, 1958. Havana. A fingerprint card and photograph arrive at the FBI's Identification Division from the Cuban Army's Military Intelligence Service. The subject is Frank Fiorini, also known as Frank Anthony Sturgis. He's got a Marine Corps record, claims he fought from 1942 to 1945, then served again until 1948. By trade, he ran a bar in Virginia Beach, but Havana authorities are calling him something else. A courier for the 26th of July movement, the rebels fighting Batista. The Cubans pick him up on July 18, 1958, holding him in custody under suspicion of running messages between Miami and Santiago de Cuba. Lieutenant Roberto Vila, Cuban Army Intelligence, is the point of contact. Vila tells the Americans this Fiorini, alias Sturgis, isn't just passing notes. He's deep with contacts. Richard Saunders, a known fixer in Miami. Heidi Santa Marina, the wife of rebel Enrique Marti, and an alias known only as Soilo, who ran operations out of Santiago. Fiorini says he met Saunders in Miami. Saunders pitched him, "Get into Cuba, head for the mountains, bring back a story about US citizens being held by rebels." Saunders figured it'd be worth $500. Fiorini liked the sound of it. He booked a Pan Am flight July 4th, flew Havana to Santiago the next day, and settled into a rebel safe house. The Cubans were watching. On July 18th, they grabbed him in a Santiago boarding house, known as a 26th of July contact point. He was sharing space with the daughter of the landlady, who was a sympathizer herself. She later told Vila she'd only agreed to play a role because she was threatened with being thrown out of Cuba. When arrested, Fiorini was carrying a reservation slip for a Pan Am flight to Miami. He told Vila he was planning to leave the same day. The Cubans didn't buy it. They had already seen him in deep with Soilo, whose job was bombing placements and arranging rebel volunteers. Soilo, Vila explained, was no low-level contact. He was critical to the operation. During questioning, Fiorini showed bruises on his arms and back, red streaks from beatings with a stick. The Sim gave him medical care, but not before noting he'd been warned. Soilo himself had told him not to wander into rebel zones. July 28th, Vila tells US officials the man's real name is Frank Sturgis. He claims to have legally changed it from Fiorini. Vila supplies fresh details. Born Norfolk, Virginia, 1924. 5'11", 190 pounds, black wavy hair, brown eyes. Identifying marks: a mole inside his left forearm, a scar outside the right wrist. Military: Marine Corps Raider Battalion, South Pacific. Later, US Army in Germany. Uncle: Frank Fiorini, Fort Lauderdale. Father: Angelo Fiorini, Norfolk. Sturgis, Vila says, first entered Cuba on April 8, 1958, with James Roxbury, driving a '52 Chevy. Customs records list him as Frank Sturgis. Miami address: 1423 Northwest 15th Street. That Chevy would turn up again loaded with ammunition. Cuban police seized it at a Havana garage. Over 300 rounds of .45 ammo in the trunk. Roland Bello tried to claim the car with a letter from Sturgis. But when police searched it, they knew exactly what it was. A mule for guns and ammo. Vila connects the dots. Richard Sunderland, an American, tied to houses in Miami and large caches of arms. J. Allen Kilgore, another American deported once already for his role with Cuban rebels. And Captain Miguel Garcia Cabarrocas, a Cuban exile with military ties, now in the States. Photographs in Sturgis's possession show him with these men. And then there's the gas tanks. Vila says Sturgis was using converted gasoline tanks to smuggle in submachine guns, at least 6 of them. By now the Cubans are convinced. Sturgis isn't just a drifter. He's a soldier of fortune tied into smuggling networks, weapon shipments, and rebel command. He's rubbing shoulders with men like Roger Sangenis, a Spaniard who fought with the Republicans and is now arranging arms for Cuba's insurrection. He's moving under aliases, running cars full of contraband, and connecting Miami, Havana, and Santiago in a web of logistics. When pressed, Sturgis insists his second trip back into Cuba, July 20th, 1958, was only to deliver a message for the rebels. He claims he didn't even know the contents. But when he was arrested, he was holding Elks Lodge membership cards under the name Fred B. Attila, photographs of himself with known arms traffickers, and letters placing him deep in rebel logistics. To the FBI, he was just another name to catalogue. To the Cubans, he was already a player in the revolution.